Welcome, dear listener, to Sleepy Rain Horror, where the line between dreams and nightmares blurs. As you drift into the unknown, remember that some whispers are better left unheard. But here, they're impossible to ignore. If you enjoy this tale and haven't fallen asleep yet, or are brave enough to stay awake, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Let's see if you can make it through to the end without a single scream. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, a soft but persistent rhythm against the car's windshield. Emily tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles pale under the dim glow of the dashboard lights. She had taken this trip to escape, a spontaneous decision after a long and grueling week at work. The winding, forest-lined roads offered a sort of peace she hadn't felt in months, but as night descended, that peace began to feel more like isolation. Her GPS, an outdated model she hadn't used in years, flickered uncertainly on the dashboard. She didn't trust it, but cell service had been non-existent for the past hour, leaving her with no choice but to rely on the device. Recalculating, the robotic voice announced for the 5th time in 20 minutes. "Great," Emily muttered, glancing at the dimly lit screen. The map seemed to glitch, showing her position as a blinking dot surrounded by unmarked roads. The rain grew heavier, the rhythmic tapping turning into a relentless drumming. The wipers struggled to keep up, smearing the water rather than clearing it. Ahead, the road forked, but the GPS offered no guidance. "Left or right?" she mused aloud, her voice the only sound in the car aside from the rain. After a moment's hesitation, she turned left. The road narrowed as the forest closed in around her. The trees on either side were ancient, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out what little moonlight remained. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were leaning closer, as if they were watching her. She turned up the heater, trying to dispel the sudden chill that crept into the car. Her headlights barely penetrated the dense darkness ahead, the light swallowed by the mist rising from the wet ground. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The GPS screen went dark, and when Emily tapped it in frustration, the device let out a faint whine before shutting off completely. "Fantastic," she sighed, her breath fogging the air. Up ahead, a sign appeared, its paint faded and peeling. She slowed the car to read it. Whispering Woods, established 1846. The name sent a shiver down her spine. There was something about it, something familiar. Had she heard of this place before? A memory tugged at the edge of her mind, but it slipped away before she could grasp it. The rain lessened as she continued, now reduced to a gentle patter. The oppressive silence of the woods pressed against her ears. She reached for the radio, hoping for music to fill the void, but all she found was static. Her fingers hovered over the dial when she heard it. A voice. It was faint, buried beneath the static, but unmistakable. "Turn back." Emily froze, her hand trembling as she turned the volume down. The voice faded, leaving only the soft hiss of static. She shook her head. "It's just the storm messing with the signal," she told herself, though her voice lacked conviction. The road twisted and turned, each bend more disorienting than the last. Emily began to feel as though she was driving in circles. The same gnarled tree with a split trunk appeared on her left 3 times, though she swore she hadn't doubled back. And then she saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by her headlights. Emily slammed on the brakes, her heart leaping into her throat. The car skidded to a stop, the tires sliding on the slick pavement. The figure didn't move. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat that hung limply from his frame. His face was obscured by the shadows, but Emily could feel his gaze piercing through the windshield, cold and unyielding. She fumbled for the door lock, her fingers shaking as she pressed the button. The sound of the locks clicking into place was deafening in the stillness. The man raised one hand, slowly pointing toward the woods to her right. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears. She shook her head, as if to say, "No, I'm not going there." The man's hand dropped to his side, and he began to walk toward her. Panic seized her. She threw the car into reverse, her tires squealing as she backed away. The man disappeared into the shadows, swallowed by the trees, but the sense of his presence lingered. She turned the car around, her breath coming in short gasps. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the rain falling heavier once more, as if the forest itself was trying to keep her from leaving. But she couldn't leave. The road dead-ended at a clearing. Emily slammed on the brakes, staring at the scene before her. The clearing was dominated by a massive tree, its trunk blackened and scarred as if it had been struck by lightning. Beneath its twisted branches stood an old wooden sign, its letters barely legible. The Whispering Tree. A faint whisper brushed against her ears, too soft to make out the words, but close enough to send a chill racing down her spine. Emily's hand reached for the car door handle, her movements mechanical, as though she were no longer in control. The whispers grew louder as she stepped into the clearing, merging into a cacophony of voices. They seemed to come from the tree, from the ground, from the very air around her. She stumbled toward the sign, compelled by a force she couldn't explain. Her eyes scanned the faded lettering beneath the tree's name, her heart sinking as she read the words. Those who hear the whispers belong to the woods. Before she could react, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on her like a weight. She turned back to the car, her breath hitching in her throat. The man was standing by the driver's side door, his face finally visible in the dim light. His eyes were hollow, his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, and then he whispered, "Run." Emily didn't wait to process the man's chilling command. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. She turned on her heel and sprinted toward the woods, her shoes slipping on the wet grass. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around her in a language she couldn't understand. The air felt heavy, each breath a struggle as if the forest itself was trying to suffocate her. She risked a glance over her shoulder, expecting to see the man following her. But he wasn't. Instead, he stood motionless by her car, his hollow eyes fixed on her retreating form. His grin had stretched unnaturally wide, almost splitting his face in two. Emily plunged into the trees, the branches clawing at her clothes and hair. The rain, muffled by the dense canopy above, became a distant patter. The whispers seemed to grow stronger the deeper she went, transforming into distinct words that clawed at her sanity. Emily. Her name, spoken in a voice that wasn't hers, echoed from the darkness. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Emily. It came again, closer this time. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something wrong about it, something cold and hollow. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The forest answered with silence. She pressed on, her steps quick and unsteady. The ground beneath her feet grew softer, sucking at her shoes with each step. The trees seemed to shift around her, their gnarled trunks twisting in unnatural ways. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together what was happening. Why had she listened to the GPS? Why had she stopped for the man in the road? And most importantly, why did she feel as if the forest knew her, as if it had been waiting for her? Ahead, a faint light flickered between the trees. Desperate for any sign of safety, she stumbled toward it. The light led her to a small cabin, its windows glowing with a warm, golden hue. Smoke curled from the crooked chimney, and the faint scent of burning wood mingled with the damp air. Emily hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But where could she go? The forest was alive with whispers, and she had no sense of direction. She climbed the creaking steps to the porch, her hand trembling as she reached for the door. Before she could knock, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a dimly lit interior. "Hello," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no response. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly clean. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. A table in the center of the room was set for one, with a steaming bowl of soup and a single chair. It was as if someone had been expecting her. Emily's stomach growled, the scent of the soup enticing. She hadn't eaten since she left the city hours ago, but something about the scene felt wrong. Too perfect, too inviting. "Hello," she tried again, her voice wavering. The whispers outside the cabin grew louder, as if urging her to stay. The door slammed shut behind her, and the fire flared, its light intensifying. Emily backed away from the table, her eyes darting around the room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with strange objects. Jars of murky liquid, bundles of dried herbs, and what looked like old photographs. She moved closer to one of the photos, her breath catching in her throat. It was a picture of her. She was standing in the clearing by the whispering tree, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. She turned the frame over, hoping for some explanation, and found a single word scrawled on the back: "Welcome." The whispers inside the cabin began, soft at first, but quickly rising to a deafening crescendo. They came from everywhere: the walls, the floor, even the air itself. "Emily, stay, belong." She covered her ears, sinking to the floor as the voices pressed in on her. The fire roared, casting monstrous shadows that danced across the walls. Through the cacophony, a new sound emerged: footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the second floor. Emily forced herself to stand, her legs trembling as she backed toward the door. Her hand fumbled for the knob, but it wouldn't turn. She was trapped. The footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs with agonizing slowness. Emily's breath hitched as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, her face hidden beneath a veil of long, dark hair. She wore a tattered dress that seemed to ripple as if underwater. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as though she were a puppet controlled by invisible strings. The woman stopped at the foot of the stairs, her head tilting at an impossible angle. When she spoke, her voice was a chilling blend of many voices, all speaking in unison. "You shouldn't have come." Emily's scream caught in her throat as the woman took a step forward. Desperation surged through her, and she grabbed the nearest object, a heavy candlestick from the table. "Stay back," she shouted, though her voice cracked with fear. The woman didn't stop. Her hollow eyes locked onto Emily's, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "You're already ours," the voices hissed. The walls of the cabin began to shake, the jars on the shelves shattering and spilling their contents onto the floor. The fire flared one last time before extinguishing, plunging the room into darkness. Emily swung the candlestick blindly, connecting with nothing but air. The whispers surged around her, louder and more chaotic, until she could no longer tell where they were coming from. And then, silence. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her car. The rain was falling softly again, the windshield wipers moving rhythmically. The GPS glowed faintly on the dashboard, the map displaying a clear route back to the main highway. For a moment, she thought it had all been a dream, but as she reached for the steering wheel, her hand brushed against something cold and wet. She looked down to see a single muddy handprint smeared across her armrest, and from the forest behind her, the whispers began again. Emily's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, her eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. The forest loomed around her, its darkness impenetrable, and the whispers seemed to hum just beneath the sound of the rain. The GPS beeped, startling her. The map displayed a single winding line leading her out of the woods, a glowing blue arrow pointing her way. "Just drive," she whispered to herself. Her foot pressed the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward. She forced her eyes to stay on the road, ignoring the shadows that flickered at the edges of her vision. The rain grew heavier, the wipers struggling to keep up, and then the voice returned. Emily. Her name, spoken softly, as if someone were sitting in the back seat. She didn't dare look in the mirror. Her heart pounded as she pressed the gas harder, the car speeding through the narrow, twisting road. The trees blurred into a wall of black and green. "Emily," the voice repeated, clearer now, and impossibly close. Her resolve broke, and she glanced at the mirror. The back seat was empty. Relief flooded her for a moment, until she noticed something else. A figure was standing in the middle of the road ahead, directly in her path. Emily screamed and slammed on the brakes. The car skidded on the wet pavement, spinning out of control. The headlights swung wildly, illuminating the forest in chaotic bursts before the car came to a screeching halt, inches from a massive tree. Her head slammed against the steering wheel, and for a moment the world spun. She groaned, pressing a hand to her forehead. When she looked up, her blood ran cold. The figure stood directly in front of the car, illuminated by the headlights. It was the woman from the cabin. Her hair hung in wet, tangled strands over her face, and her dress clung to her thin frame. Her head tilted unnaturally as she took a step closer, her bare feet making no sound on the wet ground. Emily's instincts screamed at her to run, but she was frozen. Her body refused to move as the woman reached out a hand, pressing it against the hood of the car. The engine sputtered and died. The cabin plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the dashboard. Emily's breaths came in shallow gasps as the woman moved to the driver's side window, her movements slow and deliberate. The rain distorted her features, but Emily could see her hollow eyes, her lips curling into that same grotesque grin. "Let me in," the woman whispered, her voice a low, guttural rasp. Emily shook her head violently, fumbling to lock the doors. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the handle, her mind racing for a plan. The woman's grin widened, and she pressed her face closer to the glass. "You can't leave," she hissed. With a surge of adrenaline, Emily threw the car into reverse. The tires screeched as the car shot backward, narrowly avoiding the tree. She spun the wheel, her headlights cutting through the rain as she sped back onto the road. In the mirror, the woman stood motionless, her figure disappearing into the darkness as the car raced away. The road twisted and turned, the forest growing denser with each passing mile. Emily's chest heaved as she struggled to keep the car on the slippery pavement. The GPS beeped again, its screen flickering before shutting off entirely. "No, no, no!" she yelled, slamming her fist against the dashboard. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the car with their dissonant chorus. "Stay, belong, come back." Her vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. She wiped them away, trying to focus on the road. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, the windshield wipers utterly useless. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the rain stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the engine. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. Emily slowed the car, her hands trembling on the wheel. She squinted through the windshield, realizing the road ahead was no longer paved. It had turned to dirt, the trees closing in tightly on either side. Her heart sank as she saw what lay ahead. The whispering tree. The massive blackened trunk loomed in the headlights, its twisted branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal arms. The clearing was exactly as she had left it, though the air felt heavier now, the whispers louder. Emily slammed the brakes, her car skidding to a stop. She stared at the tree, her breath hitching in her throat. From behind the tree, figures began to emerge. Dozens of them. Men, women, and children, their faces pale and lifeless, their eyes hollow. They moved slowly, their bodies jerking as though they were being pulled by invisible strings. At the center of them all stood the woman from the cabin, her grin impossibly wide. "You were always meant to stay," she said, her voice echoing with the whispers. Emily's scream tore through the silence as the figures surged toward the car. She threw the car into reverse, her tires spinning uselessly in the mud. The whispers grew deafening, drowning out her thoughts. "Stay, stay, stay." The last thing Emily saw before everything went black was the woman's face, pressed against the windshield, her hollow eyes staring into her soul. When Emily woke, she was standing beneath the whispering tree. The forest was silent, the rain long gone. She looked down and saw her own face staring up at her, from a photograph nailed to the tree's trunk. Beneath it, scrawled in jagged letters, were the words, "Those who hear the whispers belong to the woods." As the whispers began anew, Emily realized she was no longer alone. She was one of them now. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears as the car sped down the muddy, twisting road. She had no idea where she was going. She only knew she had to get away. The forest pressed close on either side, the ancient trees whispering secrets in a language she couldn't understand. The rain came down harder, a torrential downpour that blurred the windshield. The headlights were useless, casting faint beams of light swallowed almost immediately by the darkness. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A figure darting between the trees, keeping pace with her car. Her breath hitched as she gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white. "No," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "It's not real. It's not real." But the figure was real. A woman in a tattered dress, her hair plastered to her face by the rain, running alongside the car. And she was smiling. The road narrowed further, forcing Emily to slow down. The woman's grin widened, and she veered closer to the car, her hollow eyes locked onto Emily's. Without thinking, Emily jerked the wheel to the right, the tires skidding on the slick mud. The car spun wildly, the world tilting as the vehicle slammed into a ditch. The engine sputtered and died. Emily's head struck the steering wheel, pain blossoming behind her eyes. Dazed, she lifted her head and peered through the cracked windshield. The woman was gone. The rain eased into a steady drizzle, the forest once again still. Emily fumbled for her phone, praying for a signal, but the screen was blank. She cursed, shoving it back into her pocket. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to stay in the car, to lock the doors and wait until daylight. But then she heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping on the roof of the car. Her breath caught in her throat as the sound grew louder, more deliberate. She leaned forward, peering through the rain-streaked window, but the night was impenetrable. "Go away," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The tapping stopped. Silence. And then, from directly behind her, "Emily!" she screamed, twisting around in her seat. The back was empty. Her heart pounded as she fumbled with the door handle, throwing it open and stumbling into the mud. The rain soaked her instantly, chilling her to the bone. She turned in frantic circles, searching the shadows for whoever or whatever had whispered her name. But she was alone. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the whispers silenced for the moment. Emily's eyes darted to the tree line, and her stomach dropped. The whispering tree loomed in the distance, its blackened branches stretching like skeletal arms toward the sky. "No," she muttered, shaking her head. "I was going the other way. I was—" Her words faltered as she realized the road she had been driving on was gone. In its place was a narrow, muddy path leading directly to the clearing. Emily staggered forward, her legs heavy as if the mud itself was trying to pull her down. The path seemed to stretch endlessly, the forest growing darker with each step. And then she saw them. Figures emerging from the shadows, their faces pale and lifeless. They moved slowly, their limbs jerking awkwardly like marionettes. At first, there were only a few, but as she approached the clearing, more and more figures appeared, until they surrounded her on all sides. Her chest tightened, her breathing shallow as she tried to push past them. But their hollow eyes followed her, unblinking, their mouths opening and closing silently as if trying to speak. And then the whispers returned. "Stay. Belong. Emily." The clearing opened up before her, the whispering tree dominating the center. Its gnarled trunk seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the bark covered in deep, jagged scars. At the base of the tree stood the woman. Her dress was torn and soaked with mud, her hair hanging in wet strands around her face. She smiled that terrible, too wide smile and held out a hand, beckoning Emily closer. "No!" Emily screamed, backing away. The woman's smile faltered, her face twisting into something darker, something monstrous. Her eyes burned with an unnatural light as she took a step forward, the figures in the clearing closing ranks behind her. "You cannot leave," the woman hissed, her voice layered with the echoes of 100 others. Emily's back hit the edge of the tree, and she gasped, spinning around. The bark was ice-cold beneath her fingers, the jagged scars cutting into her palms. She looked up, and her breath caught in her throat. Photographs were nailed to the tree's trunk, dozens of them, each weathered and faded. And in every photo, there was a face she recognized, her own. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and Emily sank to her knees, clutching her head. The figures closed in, their lifeless eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The woman knelt before her, tilting her head as if examining a puzzle. "You belong to us now," she whispered. Emily opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw was the woman's hollow eyes, and the last thing she felt was the cold embrace of the earth as the forest swallowed her whole. The next morning, the storm had passed. The forest was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth. A traveler passing through the area noticed an old, abandoned car in the ditch, its doors hanging open. He peered inside, but it was empty. In the distance, a faint whisper carried on the breeze, soft and almost musical. And beneath the whispering tree, a new photograph had appeared. It was Emily's face, her hollow eyes staring out into the forest, forever a part of the woods. The world didn't move on from Emily. Not entirely. Days after her disappearance, the local news covered her story briefly. Emily Carter, 29, last seen traveling through rural highways, vehicle found abandoned in the Whispering Woods area. There were no signs of a struggle, no clues as to where she might have gone. The car was towed and forgotten, and with no family pushing for answers, the case went cold. But the forest remembered. It was a month later when a new visitor came to the Whispering Woods, a man named Ryan. He was a hiker, a thrill-seeker drawn to places with dark histories. Ryan had heard whispers, not the ones that emanated from the woods, but rumors shared in hushed tones at local diners. People vanish out there, they said. The woods don't like to let you go. Ryan had laughed it off. Stories of ghosts and cursed forests were good for tourism, he thought, but nothing more. Still, he packed a camera, eager to capture the eerie beauty of the infamous woods. As he stood at the edge of the tree line, the towering pines casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun, a chill crept up his spine. He shook it off, tightened the straps of his backpack, and stepped into the forest. The trail was overgrown, as if nature itself had tried to erase it. Ryan pushed forward, brushing aside low-hanging branches and stepping carefully over roots that snaked across the ground like veins. The air grew colder as he went deeper, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the dense canopy. The whispers began softly, so faint he thought it was the wind. But the further he walked, the clearer they became. Ryan. He froze, his head snapping toward the sound. "Hello," he called, his voice steady but loud enough to echo through the trees. No answer. He shook his head and continued, dismissing the sound as his imagination. But the forest had a way of making itself heard. The deeper Ryan ventured, the stranger the forest became. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches intertwining overhead like prison bars. The air smelled damp and metallic, and the dirt beneath his boots grew softer, almost spongy. And then he found the clearing. The whispering tree stood at its center, its blackened bark gleaming faintly in the dim light. The massive, gnarled roots jutted out of the earth like skeletal fingers, and the twisted branches stretched upward, clawing at the sky. Ryan stared at the tree, his camera forgotten in his hands. For a moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu, as if he had been here before. And then he saw the photographs. Nailed to the tree's trunk were dozens of them, their edges curling with age. He stepped closer, squinting at the images. The faces were blurred, some too faded to make out, but others were hauntingly clear. Men, women, children, all staring back at him with hollow eyes. Ryan's stomach turned as he recognized one of the faces. It was a young woman with dark hair and a faint smile. He had seen her photo on the missing persons flyer at the diner. "Emily Carter," he whispered. As he spoke her name, the whispers in the forest grew louder. They came from all directions, surrounding him in a dissonant chorus. Stay, belong, Ryan. Ryan stumbled back, his heart racing. He turned to run, but the clearing had changed. The path he had entered from was gone, replaced by a wall of trees that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The whispers followed him, growing more insistent. Stay, belong. He tripped over a root, falling hard onto the damp earth. His camera skittered away, landing at the base of the tree, and then he saw her, Emily. She stood beneath the whispering tree, her figure pale and ethereal. Her eyes were hollow, her face devoid of emotion. The tattered remains of her clothing clung to her frame, and her lips moved silently, as if whispering secrets only the forest could hear. Emily, Ryan croaked, his voice trembling. She tilted her head, her movements slow and unnatural. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of recognition. Help me, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Ryan scrambled to his feet, reaching for her, but she took a step back, her body melting into the shadows of the tree. No, he shouted, but his cry was swallowed by the forest. The whispers surged, louder now, almost deafening. The photographs on the tree began to shift and change, new faces appearing among the old. Ryan's breath caught in his throat as he saw his own face staring back at him, his eyes wide with terror. He backed away, his mind racing. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees twisting and contorting as if alive. And then the woman appeared. The same woman Emily had encountered, her hollow eyes and too wide grin sending a wave of cold terror through Ryan's body. You came, she said, her voice layered with countless others. Just as she did. Ryan shook his head, stumbling back. I'm leaving, he said, his voice shaking. The woman laughed, a sound that echoed unnaturally in the clearing. No one leaves, she said, stepping closer. You belong to the woods now. Ryan turned and ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest blurred around him, the path twisting and shifting beneath his feet. The whispers grew louder, and the woman's laughter echoed in his ears. And then, silence. He opened his eyes and found himself standing at the edge of the whispering trees clearing. The photographs on the tree were still there, but his was gone. Instead, a single word was scrawled across the bark in jagged letters. Run. Ryan didn't wait. He bolted through the forest, the path miraculously clear before him. The whispers faded, and the air grew warmer. When he finally burst out of the trees and onto the main road, he collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. Behind him, the forest was quiet, but the whispering woods were patient. They always waited for their next visitor. Ryan didn't speak of what he saw in the woods, not at first. When he stumbled into the small town diner the next morning, covered in mud and trembling, the locals knew better than to press him for details. They'd seen the look before, the pale skin, the haunted eyes, the stammered insistence that something was wrong in those woods. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and an air of quiet knowing, set a cup of steaming coffee in front of him without a word. You're lucky to have made it out, she said finally, her voice low. Ryan looked up at her, his hands trembling as they gripped the cup. You've seen it too? She didn't answer. Instead, she leaned closer, glancing around as if the very walls had ears. Leave town, she said. Don't look back. Ryan didn't leave. Something about the whispering tree clung to him, as if its roots had burrowed into his mind. The photographs, the voices, Emily, it all haunted him. He couldn't sleep. When he closed his eyes, he saw her face, pale and hollow-eyed, whispering for help. When he finally drifted into uneasy dreams, they were filled with the forest, branches reaching for him, shadows moving in the corner of his vision, whispers that followed him no matter how fast he ran, and always the tree. It stood in the center of his mind, blackened and alive, its gnarled limbs stretching endlessly. He could feel it watching him, waiting. Desperation drove Ryan back to the diner 2 days later. He cornered the waitress as she was closing up, his voice hoarse, his eyes bloodshot. "I need to know what happened to her," he said, gripping her arm. "The girl, Emily Carter. I saw her. She's still in there." The woman froze, her face tight with fear. "She's gone," she whispered, "like all the others." "No," Ryan snapped, slamming his hand on the counter. "She was there. She spoke to me. She asked for help." The woman shook her head, her expression a mix of pity and sorrow. "That wasn't her. Not anymore." Ryan stared at her, his mind racing. What does that mean? What's in those woods? The woman hesitated, then sighed. "The woods, they don't let go. Once you hear the whispers, you're marked. They'll call you back, no matter how far you run." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "And if you go back, they'll take you too." Ryan didn't heed her warning. The next morning, he packed a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a notebook. He told himself it wasn't about Emily or the whispers. He just needed answers. He needed to see the tree again, to prove to himself that he wasn't losing his mind. The trail was harder to find this time, as if the forest was trying to keep him out. But Ryan pressed on, using his camera to document every step. The whispers began sooner this time, faint at first, like a distant wind. But the further he went, the louder they grew. "Ryan, come back, stay." By the time he reached the clearing, the whispers were deafening. The whispering tree loomed before him, its twisted branches stretching against the gray sky. The photographs were still there, though they seemed brighter now, sharper. Ryan's stomach churned as he recognized more faces, people he'd seen on missing posters, faces from the diner's bulletin board. And there, at the very center, was Emily's photograph. It had changed. Her hollow eyes now seemed to follow him, her faint smile twisted into something desperate. Beneath the photo, fresh scratches marred the bark, forming a single word: help. Ryan's hands trembled as he reached for the photograph. He didn't know why, what he hoped to accomplish, but something compelled him. The moment his fingers touched the photo, the forest erupted in sound. The whispers became screams, a cacophony of voices shouting in anger, in anguish, in desperation. The ground beneath him trembled, and the air grew thick and suffocating. And then the figures appeared. They emerged from the shadows, one by one, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. Men, women, children, all of them pale and lifeless, their movements jerky and unnatural. At their center was Emily. Her form was more solid now, her features sharper, but her eyes were the same, empty and hollow, filled with something ancient and malevolent. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice layered with others. "You shouldn't have come back." "I came to help you," Ryan stammered, backing away. Emily tilted her head, her lips curling into a faint smile. "You can't help me." The figures closed in, their whispers blending into a single overpowering voice. "Stay, stay." Ryan stumbled, falling to his knees. His flashlight flickered, the beam cutting through the shadows but doing little to dispel the darkness. Emily stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "It's your turn now," she said softly. Ryan shook his head violently, scrambling to his feet. "No, I'm not staying." The whispers rose, a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very ground. "You don't have a choice," Emily said, her smile widening. Ryan turned and ran, the forest a blur around him. The path shifted beneath his feet, twisting and turning in impossible ways. The whispers followed him, relentless. And then he saw it, a faint glow in the distance, the outline of the road. Hope surged in his chest, and he pushed himself harder, his legs burning with effort. The whispers grew fainter, the air lighter. And then, just as he reached the edge of the forest, he heard her voice one last time. "Ryan, you'll be back." When he stumbled onto the road, gasping for air, he didn't look back. But deep in the forest, beneath the whispering tree, a new photograph appeared. It was Ryan's face, his eyes wide with terror. Beneath it, scrawled in jagged letters, was a single word. Ryan didn't leave town. Though his escape from the forest should have brought relief, it only left questions. He couldn't stop replaying the scene at the whispering tree, the photographs, Emily's hollow eyes, and the words carved into the bark. Help. It felt like an unfinished sentence, as if the forest was toying with him, daring him to come back. But there was something else, a nagging certainty that he had left a piece of himself behind. The photograph. His own face nailed to the tree, etched into the fabric of the whispering woods. How could that be possible if he had escaped? And worse, what would happen when the woods came to collect what belonged to them? 2 nights after his return to town, Ryan was awoken by the sound of whispering. It started faintly, barely audible over the hum of the motel air conditioner. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding as he strained to hear. Ryan. The voice was soft, feminine, familiar. He leapt out of bed and rushed to the window, throwing the curtains aside. The parking lot outside was empty, lit by a single flickering street lamp. But the voice continued, more insistent now. "Ryan, come back." He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he paced the small room, the whispers growing louder and more persistent. He tried blasting the television, drowning them in static, even shouting at them to stop, but nothing worked. By dawn, he was a wreck. Dark circles framed his bloodshot eyes, and his hands trembled as he clutched his coffee. The whispers had stopped when the sun rose, leaving him in silence that felt almost mocking. Ryan stared at his reflection in the motel mirror. His face looked older, gaunt, as if the forest had drained a part of him. "I can't stay here," he muttered. But even as he said it, he knew he wouldn't leave. Not yet. The next day, Ryan returned to the diner. It was quiet, the lunch rush long over, and the waitress from before stood behind the counter, wiping down tables. She froze when she saw him. "You're still here?" she asked, her voice low and tense. Ryan nodded, sliding into a booth. "I need to know what's happening to me." The waitress sighed, setting her cloth aside. "I told you to leave." "I can't," Ryan said. His voice cracked, and he leaned forward, his desperation raw. "They won't let me." She studied him for a long moment, then sat across from him. "The woods have their own rules," she said quietly. "Once they've marked you, you're theirs. You might think you escaped, but you didn't. You're just," she hesitated, "borrowed." Ryan's hands tightened into fists. "What does that mean?" "Borrowed." The waitress shook her head. "The woods always take back what belongs to them. It's only a matter of time." "No," Ryan said, his voice firm. "I saw Emily. She was trying to communicate. If I can figure out what she wants, what they want, maybe I can stop this." The waitress's expression darkened. "You can't bargain with the woods, Ryan. People have tried. No one comes back whole." "But they do come back," Ryan pressed. "How?" For a moment, she said nothing. Then she stood, pulling a notepad from her apron pocket. She scribbled something quickly and handed it to him. "This man knows more than I do," she said. "But if you go looking for answers, don't expect to like what you find." Ryan glanced at the paper. A name and an address. Thomas Grant, Whispering Woods Ranger Station. The ranger station was nearly as old as the forest itself, a small wooden structure hidden at the edge of the woods. Ryan found Thomas Grant sitting on the porch, a grizzled man in his 60s with sharp eyes and a cigarette dangling from his lips. "You're him, aren't you?" Grant said as Ryan approached. "The one who made it out." Ryan stopped short. "How do you know that?" Grant smirked, taking a drag from his cigarette. "Because the woods don't let many people go. And when they do, it's never for long." Ryan felt a chill run down his spine. "I need to know what's happening to me. Why I keep hearing them. Why they won't leave me alone." Grant stood, tossing the cigarette onto the ground and crushing it beneath his boot. "You're tethered," he said. "The forest has you hooked, and unless you cut the line, it'll reel you back in." "Cut the line?" Ryan asked, his voice shaking. "How?" Grant stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "There's only one way. You go back to the Whispering Tree and destroy your tether, your photograph. Burn it, bury it, tear it down. If you do it right, the woods might let you go." "Might?" Grant shrugged. "The woods are fickle. Even if you destroy the photo, they might not be done with you. But it's the only shot you've got." Ryan nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then I'll do it." Grant reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial filled with a dark liquid. "Take this," he said. "It's oil mixed with sage. You'll need it to light a fire at the tree. It won't burn easy." Ryan took the vial, his hands trembling. "Why are you helping me?" Grant's expression hardened. "Because no one helped me when it was my turn." That night, Ryan stood at the edge of the forest, the vial in one hand and a lighter in the other. The whispers started immediately, soft and pleading. "Ryan, don't stay, belong." He took a deep breath and stepped into the woods. The path to the clearing was shorter this time, as if the forest wanted him to come back. When he reached the Whispering Tree, the photograph seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. There, near the center, was his face. Ryan stepped forward, unscrewing the vial and pouring the oil over the photograph. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, the air around him vibrating with rage. But he didn't hesitate. He flicked the lighter, the small flame dancing in the darkness, and pressed it against the photograph. The fire caught slowly, the bark of the tree hissing and crackling as the flames spread. The screams of the forest grew louder, the ground shaking beneath Ryan's feet. "Stay!" the voices howled. "You can't leave." Ryan stumbled back as the tree erupted in flames, the photographs curling and blackening. For a moment, he thought he saw Emily's face in the fire, her eyes wide with something that could have been gratitude or despair. And then everything went silent. Ryan woke hours later, lying on the edge of the forest. The sun was rising, casting golden light over the trees. The whispers were gone. For the first time in days, the world felt still. But deep in the woods, beneath the charred remains of the whispering tree, a single photograph remained untouched. Ryan's face. And beneath it, scrawled in fresh bark, "We are not finished." Ryan left the woods that morning, but the weight of the forest came with him. The days that followed were eerily quiet. For the first time in weeks, the whispers were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt almost worse. But the photograph, the one that had refused to burn, haunted his mind. He told himself it was over. He had done what Grant suggested, and the forest had gone quiet. That had to mean something. Yet every time he closed his eyes, he saw the tree, the charred bark, his own face staring back at him, untouched by the flames. And beneath it, the words, "We are not finished." 2 nights after the fire, Ryan dreamed of Emily again. In the dream, she stood at the edge of his motel bed, her hollow eyes staring down at him. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out, only the faint rustling of leaves, growing louder and louder. When he woke, the silence in the room was suffocating. The air felt heavy, and a faint, earthy scent lingered, like damp soil and rotting wood. He glanced at the window and froze. There on the glass was a handprint, small, delicate, and smudged with dirt. By morning, Ryan was back at the diner, staring into his coffee as if it held answers. The waitress approached cautiously, her face tight with worry. "You look worse than before," she said. Ryan chuckled bitterly, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "That's because it's not over. I burned the tree, but something's still wrong." The waitress frowned, sitting across from him. "The tree burned." He nodded. The photographs, the whispers, everything went up in flames. "But my photo didn't burn. It's still there. And now..." He trailed off, his eyes darting to the window. "I think the forest is following me." Her face paled. "That's not possible. The woods don't leave their borders." "Then explain this," Ryan snapped, pulling out his phone. He had taken a picture of the dirt-streaked handprint before leaving the motel. The waitress stared at the screen, her lips tightening. "You need to talk to Grant again." The ranger station felt different this time. The air around it was colder, and the woods seemed to loom closer, as if the trees had crept nearer in his absence. Grant was on the porch again, a rifle leaning against his chair. He watched Ryan approach, his expression grim. "I knew you'd be back," Grant said. Ryan wasted no time. The whispers stopped, but my photo didn't burn. And now, he gestured vaguely, his frustration bubbling over. "Now, it feels like the forest is everywhere." Grant sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I told you, the woods don't let go easy. Burning the photo was just step 1. If it didn't burn completely, what happens if it didn't burn?" Ryan demanded. Grant hesitated, then stood and picked up his rifle. It means they're not done with you. The forest wants something, and until it gets it, it'll keep pulling you back. What does it want? Ryan asked, his voice desperate. Grant didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned for Ryan to follow him. The two men walked behind the station, where a series of old maps and photographs were pinned to a corkboard nailed to the wall. Grant pointed to a map of the Whispering Woods, its boundaries marked in bold red ink. These woods are older than the town, older than anything we've ever put on paper, he said. They don't follow our rules. People disappear in there all the time, and the few who make it out. He glanced at Ryan. They're never the same. Ryan swallowed hard. What's that got to do with me? Grant jabbed a finger at a spot on the map, the location of the Whispering Tree. It's not just a tree. It's a tether, a gate between this world and whatever's out there. When you destroyed part of it, you broke the connection. But not completely. Something got loose. Ryan felt his stomach drop. Something got loose? Grant nodded. And now it's tied to you. That's why you're seeing things, hearing things. It's not the woods anymore. It's what came through them. Ryan stared at the map, his mind racing. How do I stop it? Grant sighed, lighting another cigarette. You don't. Ryan's hands clenched into fists. There has to be a way. You said the woods take people. Why? What do they want? Grant hesitated, his eyes dark. They feed, he said finally, on fear, on souls, on whatever makes us human. And when they're done with you, they turn you into one of them, another whisper in the woods. Ryan's blood ran cold. So, I'm food. Not yet, Grant said, but you're marked. If you want to stop this, you need to sever the connection completely. That means going back to where it started and finishing the job. Ryan shook his head. I already burned the tree. You didn't destroy the roots, Grant said. And until you do, the forest will keep pulling you back. That night, Ryan prepared for the journey back into the woods. This time, he packed everything he could think of. A flashlight, extra batteries, a knife, a canteen, and the vial of oil Grant had given him. He didn't know what he would face, but he was determined to end it. As he stood at the edge of the forest, the whispers began again, faint but persistent. Ryan, come home. You belong. He took a deep breath and stepped into the shadows. The forest was darker than before, its paths twisting and unfamiliar. The Whispering Tree was gone, reduced to a charred stump, but the air around it was alive with something else, something cold and ancient. Ryan knelt beside the roots, pouring the last of the oil into the ground. He struck a match, the small flame flickering in the oppressive darkness. The earth trembled as the fire caught, the roots hissing and smoking. But then, the whispers turned to screams. The ground beneath Ryan's feet split open, a gaping maw of darkness. From its depths came a figure, twisted and indistinct, its form shifting like smoke. It had Emily's face, but her features were warped, her eyes black and endless. You can't destroy us, the thing hissed, its voice 1,000 whispers in unison. We are eternal. Ryan's hand shook, but he didn't stop. He threw the match into the flames, watching as the roots burned brighter. The figure lunged for him, its shadowy limbs stretching unnaturally, but Ryan stood his ground. Then take me, he said, his voice steady. but let the others go. The forest went silent. The figure froze, its black eyes narrowing. You would give yourself to us? Ryan nodded. If it means ending this. For a moment, the thing hesitated. Then it smiled, a terrible, inhuman grin. So be it. The flames consumed the roots, and the forest erupted in light. When Ryan woke, he was alone on the edge of the forest. The woods were quiet, their whispers gone. But deep in the shadows, a new voice joined the others. Ryan's. Ryan was gone. Not in the way people vanish into the woods, leaving empty homes and cold trails. No, Ryan's motel room still held his belongings. The duffel bag, the half-empty coffee cup, the jacket slung over the back of a chair. But Ryan himself? He was nowhere. The townspeople whispered about it for days, though few admitted to noticing his absence. A drifter, they called him, just passing through. And yet, those who had seen him, the waitress at the diner, the old ranger at the station, knew better. Something had happened. Something the forest wasn't finished with. Grant was the first to notice the change. The forest felt different. It wasn't quieter. If anything, the woods had grown louder since Ryan's departure. The wind howled through the trees, carrying voices that sounded almost human, and the rustling of leaves had taken on a rhythm that felt too deliberate to be natural. And then there were the sightings. Hikers reported shadowy figures moving between the trees, always just out of focus. A group of teenagers swore they heard their own names being called, even though no one else was nearby. But the worst was the tree. The whispering tree, or what was left of it, had begun to regrow. Grant didn't believe it at first. The charred stump was still there, blackened and lifeless. But around it, the earth had begun to sprout new shoots, dark, twisted roots that pulsed faintly in the moonlight, like veins carrying blood. He didn't dare touch them. Instead, he stood at the edge of the clearing, his rifle in hand, watching as the forest reclaimed its tether. It was then that he heard it. Grant. The voice was low, almost a growl, but unmistakable. Ryan. Grant froze, his breath catching in his throat. Ryan, he called, his voice trembling. The shadows at the edge of the clearing shifted, and for a moment, Grant thought he saw a figure, tall and thin, with hollow eyes that glinted faintly in the darkness. Grant. The voice came again, closer now. He raised his rifle, his hands shaking. "You're not real," he muttered. "You're just a trick. A damned trick." But the figure didn't disappear. Instead, it stepped into the clearing. It looked like Ryan, but it wasn't him. The thing wearing Ryan's face was too pale. Its skin stretched tight over angular bones. Its eyes were dark, endless pits, and when it smiled, its teeth were jagged and sharp. "Why did you send me back?" it whispered, the words dripping with venom. Grant tightened his grip on the rifle, his heart pounding. "You're not him," he said. "You're something else." The thing laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that sent shivers down Grant's spine. "I'm what you made me," it said. "What the forest made me." It stepped closer, and Grant stumbled back, his boots crunching on the dry leaves. "What do you want?" he demanded. The thing's smile widened. "To finish what I started." That night, the forest claimed its first victim. Grant's body was found the next morning, slumped against the porch of the ranger station. His eyes were wide open, his face frozen in a mask of terror. But it was his hands that told the real story. They were covered in dirt, his nails broken and bloody, as if he had been clawing at the ground, trying to dig up something, or perhaps trying to bury it. Pinned to his chest was a photograph, nailed in place with a splintered piece of wood. It was a picture of Ryan. The town didn't know what to make of Grant's death. Most wrote it off as a tragic accident, an old man succumbing to the madness of solitude. But those who had lived near the woods long enough knew better. The forest was waking up again, and this time it was hungry. The waitress from the diner was the next to hear the whispers. It started as she was closing up one evening, wiping down tables as the rain tapped gently against the windows. Ellie. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. Ellie. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the empty diner. Ryan, she whispered. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a shadow dart past the window. No, she muttered, shaking her head. This isn't happening. But the whispers grew louder, filling the diner with a chorus of voices. Ellie, help us. The next morning, Ellie packed her bags and left town. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, and no one asked. But as she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching her, its dark tendrils stretching out beyond the trees. And in her rearview mirror, she thought she saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It looked like Ryan. The town grew quieter in the weeks that followed. People avoided the forest, and those who ventured too close reported strange occurrences. Faint whispers, ghostly figures, and the feeling of being watched. The whispering tree continued to regrow, its roots spreading like veins through the earth. And deep within the forest, beneath the tangled canopy, a new photograph appeared. It was Ellie's face, nailed to the bark of a young sapling, and beneath it, carved into the wood, were the words, "We are not finished." Months passed, and the town seemed to hold its breath. The once bustling streets grew quiet, and the people who had once greeted each other with smiles now hurried through their daily routines, avoiding the woods at all costs. Whispers about the forest continued to spread, not just among the townspeople, but even beyond. Tourists, curious to explore the wilds of the Whispering Woods, were warned away by locals, told nothing but half-truths and vague stories of strange happenings. Nothing that could be proven, nothing that would really scare you. But the truth, the real truth, was there, waiting just beneath the surface, growing stronger with each passing day. Ellie never returned to town after leaving. Her family was told she'd moved away, seeking a new life far from the haunted woods. No one questioned it. No one dared. The truth was simpler, easier to accept. But some still said they heard her name, carried by the wind, calling out from deep within the trees. As for Ryan, no one spoke his name aloud. It was the beginning of autumn when the whispers grew insistent once again. It started with a man named Patrick, a hiker who had arrived at the town with a group of friends. They'd planned to camp near the edge of the woods, thinking it would be an adventure, a story to tell when they got back home. But on the second night, Patrick wandered off. His friends found him early the next morning, standing at the very edge of the Whispering Trees clearing. His eyes were wide and empty, his body stiff, as if he had been standing there for hours. His mouth was open, but no sound came out, only a strange, rhythmic hissing sound. The same noise the forest made when the wind rustled through the trees, but different, more deliberate. His friends tried to call out to him, but he didn't respond. They ran to him, shaking him by the shoulders, but when they touched him, his skin was cold, unnaturally so. As they finally pulled him away from the tree, Patrick's head jerked back, his neck cracking loudly as if something inside him had broken. His eyes flicked toward them for the briefest moment, and then he whispered one word, his voice hoarse and strained. Leave. They didn't listen. The group returned to town, panicked, their faces pale. They immediately sought help from the local authorities, and a search party was sent to look for Patrick. But the woods were vast, and the searchers found nothing but more trees and more whispers. Ryan's name surfaced again, carried on the lips of a new generation. Some said he had never left, that he was still out there, trapped somewhere in the forest, lost to whatever had claimed him. Others said he had become one with the woods, that his soul now wandered among the trees, whispering to the lost souls who dared enter. But then, something worse happened. It was a cold night in late October when the first body was found. The old man who lived on the outskirts of town, a hermit of sorts, was discovered in his cabin. His skin blackened and twisted as though something had burned its way into his very being. But it wasn't just the physical scars that struck terror into those who found him. It was the way he had died. His hands were dug into the floorboards, as if he had been desperately trying to claw his way through the wood. But he had left something behind. A photograph. The image was smeared with blood and dirt, but there was no mistaking it. It was the same photo that had appeared before, the one with the faces of those who had been taken. Ryan's, Ellie's, and now the old man's. And beneath it, scrawled in frantic, uneven handwriting, were the words, "We are not finished, and neither are you." The town was in chaos. People packed their things, their homes now nothing more than places of fear. The local sheriff, who had long dismissed the rumors, finally stood before the townspeople and confessed the truth. "The forest isn't just a place," he said. "It's a curse, an entity, a living thing that feeds on fear. And once it has you, it never lets go." Despite the warnings, there were still those who ventured into the woods, some out of curiosity, others to search for answers. A few went in hoping to rescue what remained of the people they had lost, but none returned. At first, the town thought the forest was simply taking them one by one, slowly, surely, as it had done before. But as the weeks passed, a more sinister truth became apparent. The woods weren't just taking people anymore. They were changing them. The sheriff, now older and wearied by the toll the town had taken on him, gathered what remained of the townsfolk in the town hall. Their faces were gaunt, eyes hollowed from sleepless nights and terror. He spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb the dark that hung in the air. "We have to leave," he said. His voice cracked as he spoke the words, the ones he had known deep in his heart for so long. "The forest, it's alive, and it's hunting us." There was a long silence. Finally, a voice spoke from the back of the room. "We can't just leave. We can't just run." It was when a group of college students arrived, eager to prove the myths wrong, that the full extent of the horror was revealed. They had heard the stories, everyone had, but they believed themselves immune to superstition. Armed with cameras and a desire for fame, they hiked into the woods, determined to capture proof of the supposed curse. That night, they set up camp near the clearing of the Whispering Tree. They filmed their laughter, their jokes, and their talk about how they would be the ones to debunk the stories for good. But as night fell, the air grew colder, and the wind started to pick up, carrying with it the faintest echoes of voices. They didn't hear it at first, just a murmur beneath the howling wind. But soon it became unmistakable. "Come closer." The voice was soft, almost gentle, like the sound of leaves brushing against one another. Yet it carried a weight, a sadness that tugged at their hearts. One by one, the students began to feel it, an overwhelming urge to follow, to step deeper into the woods, away from the firelight and the safety of their camp. And then one of them, a young woman named Sarah, stood and began to walk toward the trees. "Sarah!" "No!" someone shouted, but it was too late. By the time they reached the edge of the clearing, Sarah was gone, and in her place, lying in the grass, was a photograph. It was the same photograph that had haunted the others. Ryan, Ellie, the old man, and beneath it, the words, "We are not finished." The next morning, when the search party arrived, they found the rest of the students gone. Their tents were abandoned, their equipment scattered, but there was no sign of them. The only trace left behind was a pile of photographs, each with a different name, a different face, each one tied to the same chilling message. "We are not finished." The rain has now become a relentless downpour, the sound deafening against the windows. The narrator's voice drops to a near whisper. "Would you dare to enter the woods now? Or has the darkness claimed enough?" The town had fallen into a deep, uneasy silence. It was as if the people had all retreated into themselves, leaving only the dark shadows of the forest to haunt the streets. The once bustling town square was now empty, save for the occasional whisper of wind that stirred the leaves at the edges of the forest. The woods had claimed their silence, and in return, the town had given up its defiance. The last group of outsiders, the college students, had vanished without a trace. Search parties had scoured the forest for days, but no sign of them had been found. It was as if they had never existed. No photographs, no blood, no signs of struggle, only a chilling emptiness where they had last been seen. In the weeks that followed, something strange began to happen. The people of the town, who had once lived their lives with a sense of normalcy, started to feel a subtle shift in the air. It wasn't the cold, biting chill of the approaching winter, but something older, something unnatural. The whispers grew louder. They were faint at first, barely more than a murmur carried on the wind, but soon they grew clearer. The names of the missing began to echo through the streets, through the cracks in the walls of homes, through the windows at night. Ryan, Ellie, Patrick, Grant. The list grew longer every day. Each time someone heard their name, a deep sense of dread would settle over them, a cold, creeping fear that seemed to seep into their very bones. And then, as the whispers grew stronger, so did the disappearances. It started with old Mrs. Harper, the librarian who had lived in town for as long as anyone could remember. She was found one morning, curled up in the corner of her own home, eyes wide open but lifeless. Her mouth was twisted into an expression of pure terror, and her hands, oh, her hands, were clutching a photograph. The photograph was new, not one of the old ones. This one was different. It showed a man standing at the edge of the woods, a tall figure with hollow eyes. There was something about the way he looked at the camera, as if he could see into the soul of whoever gazed upon him. The photograph was pinned to Mrs. Harper's chest, as if someone, something, had placed it there. The town now knew the truth. The forest had grown stronger. It wasn't just a place. It was a presence, a living, breathing entity that took what it wanted, whether that was life or soul or memory. And it wasn't finished. The voice belonged to Tom, the town's former mechanic. He had lived here longer than anyone, and his family had called the town home for generations. "What are we supposed to do? Just leave everything we know behind?" he asked. His hands were trembling, but his voice was steady. The sheriff shook his head, his face pale. "There's no choice. It's the only way. We can't stay here any longer." But no one moved. They couldn't. Fear had paralyzed them, and deep down, each of them knew that the moment they stepped foot outside the town, they would be drawn back into the woods. The forest didn't let go of its prey that easily. That night, a storm rolled in, fierce and unrelenting. The wind howled through the trees, and the thunder seemed to shake the very foundations of the town. Rain pelted the rooftops, and the streets were flooded with water. It was during that storm, when the air was thick with tension, that the first of the disappearances occurred. Tom's wife, Sarah, was the first to go. She had been at home, preparing dinner for their children, when she heard the whispers. The wind howled, and through the cracking of the storm, she heard her name, faint but unmistakable. She went to the window, but when she looked out, there was nothing but darkness. And then, the photograph appeared on her doorstep. It was the same as the one Mrs. Harper had clutched. A man standing at the edge of the woods. His hollow eyes stared at Sarah from the photograph, and beneath it, the same chilling words. "We are not finished." The sheriff and a few others went to Tom's house the next morning, but Sarah was gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away from the house. Nothing but the photograph, now lying in the yard, staring up at them with its dark, empty eyes. Tom fell to his knees, his sobs echoing through the empty streets. "She's gone. She's gone," he whispered over and over, his voice hoarse. And then, as if in response to his grief, the whispers began again. This time, they were louder than ever, filling the air with their cold, haunting melody. Names, faces, memories, each one was swallowed by the forest. And as the wind carried the whispers through the streets, the townspeople knew that the forest was coming for them all. By the end of the week, no one was left in the town. They had all fled, running from the forest's grip, but each one knew, deep down, that they would never escape. The forest would find them, no matter where they went. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't understand, was that it wasn't just the forest they were running from. It was the forest's hunger. The hunger that grew with every soul it claimed. The hunger that would never be satisfied. And as the last of the town's residents disappeared into the night, the forest whispered one final time, "We are not finished." The town was gone. The home stood abandoned, windows shattered or boarded up, doors left ajar as if the people who once lived there had simply walked away. Nature had begun to reclaim what had been taken from it. The wild vines crept over the broken streets, the once paved roads now covered in moss and dirt. The wind blew, carrying with it the faintest echoes of voices that might have been human once, but were now something else entirely, something darker. The forest had taken everything, and still it wasn't finished. Ryan's face was the first to appear again. It wasn't in a photograph this time, but in the dark corners of the town. People who had left the area reported seeing him at the edge of their peripheral vision, standing just beyond the trees. A figure in the distance, moving with the same eerie stillness as before, the same hollow eyes, the same unnatural smile. Some thought they were just seeing things, that the memories of the forest were playing tricks on them. But the whispers returned. They grew louder, more insistent, and they carried names once more: Ryan, Ellie, Patrick, Grant, and then a new name joined the list: Sarah. Her name was whispered like a prayer, like a plea for redemption, and it filled the ears of everyone who heard it. No one could escape it. Jenna was the first to understand what was truly happening. She had been just a child when the town had been forced to leave. She had seen the photographs, had heard the stories from her parents about the people who had vanished. But it wasn't until she returned, years later, that she realized the truth. The forest had a hunger, a thirst it couldn't quench. It didn't just take bodies, it took souls. The forest fed on fear, on grief, on the despair of those who walked too close to its heart. Once it had claimed someone, it twisted their memory, their very essence, into something else. Those lost to the woods weren't gone. They were changed, reborn as part of the dark spirit of the trees. Jenna had come back to the town, hoping to find answers, hoping to understand the nightmares that had plagued her for years. She thought she could conquer the fear that had ruled her childhood. She thought the woods were only a story, a tale told to frighten children. But now, standing at the edge of the whispering woods, she felt it. Felt the same cold that had once gripped her heart as a little girl. The forest was watching her, and it was waiting. The rain started again that night, just as it had so many times before. But this time, it wasn't soothing. The raindrops pounded against the ground with the weight of an ancient sorrow. The whispers carried on the wind, no longer faint or distant. They surrounded Jenna, wrapping around her like tendrils, pulling her closer to the dark heart of the forest. Jenna. The voice was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it was unmistakable. Her name, carried on the wind. It wasn't her imagination. The forest was calling her. She stepped forward, drawn by the voice, her heart pounding in her chest. The trees seemed to shift, the shadows stretching toward her, as if they were alive, alive and hungry. Jenna, come closer. The voice was sweet now, coaxing, familiar. A voice she remembered from her childhood, her mother's voice. But it wasn't her mother. It wasn't anyone she knew. As Jenna ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew heavier, the shadows darker. The whispers grew louder, merging into one constant, relentless sound. She could hear them all: Ryan, Ellie, Patrick, Grant, Sarah. And then there was a new name, one that sent a chill through her spine. Jenna. She stopped. The forest was still. For a long moment, there was nothing. No sound. No movement. It felt as though the very earth had stopped breathing. And then she saw him. Ryan. He stood in the clearing, not far from her, his pale face illuminated by the faintest moonlight. His hollow eyes were fixed on her, his lips twisted into that same eerie smile. "You shouldn't have come back," he whispered. His voice was dry, like the crackling of dead leaves underfoot. The forest doesn't let go. Jenna took a step back, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from him. His form shimmered in the moonlight, like a mirage, and she knew, deep down, that he wasn't just standing there. He was a part of the forest now, a part of the hunger that had claimed everyone who had ever entered its depths. "I never wanted to leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know." Ryan's smile widened, a grotesque thing that didn't belong to a human face. "It doesn't matter. You can never leave." The air grew colder still, and the shadows around them seemed to shift, closing in. Jenna could feel the trees pressing closer, their gnarled branches reaching out toward her like the hands of the long dead. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and she felt a pull in her chest, as if the earth itself was drawing her toward the heart of the forest. She tried to step back, but her legs felt heavy, like they were sinking into the ground. "You're not real," she muttered, shaking her head, trying to clear the fog that had settled in her mind. "This isn't real." Ryan's hollow eyes glinted. "That's what we all thought." Suddenly, the forest roared to life. The trees creaked and groaned as if awakening from a long slumber, and the air was filled with the sound of thousands of whispers. The forest had eyes everywhere, eyes that could see into the very soul of anyone who dared venture too close. Jenna's breath caught in her throat as she felt the cold hands of the forest close around her, pulling her deeper into its embrace. She could feel the memories of those who had come before her, Ryan, Ellie, Patrick, Sarah, mingling with her own, their lives, their stories, all becoming one. Her body screamed for escape, but her mind was slipping, unraveling. The forest was taking her, just as it had taken the others. She couldn't fight it. The forest had won. The next morning, the rain stopped. The town remained empty, its silence unbroken. But in the woods, the whispering continued, louder now, as if it had gained strength from the souls it had consumed. Ryan's name, Ellie's, Sarah's, Jenna's. And then a new name joined the list, a name that would be whispered for generations to come. The forest is never finished. It had been years since Jenna's disappearance, and the town that had once stood at the edge of the whispering woods was now little more than a distant memory. No one dared to speak of it, and anyone who knew the town's dark history had long since left. The town had been forgotten, but the forest, the ancient, haunted heart of it all, remained. And it was still hungry. A young couple, eager for adventure, arrived in the area, unaware of the warnings that had been passed down through generations. Tyler and Sophie were both explorers at heart, the kind of people who thrived on the thrill of the unknown. They had read the stories, the ones about the cursed woods, but they had dismissed them as nothing more than local superstition. After all, they had hiked through forests all over the world without incident. This would be no different, they thought. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when they set up camp at the edge of the forest, laughing and joking as they built a fire. The flickering flames cast long shadows against the trees, their twisted branches stretching like hands into the night. But as the evening wore on, the atmosphere shifted. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze when they first arrived, began to pick up. It howled through the trees, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of whispers, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing minute. "Did you hear that?" Sophie asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. Tyler, who had been poking at the fire, looked up, his brow furrowing. "Hear what?" "The voices." It sounded like names. Sophie's voice was uneasy now, her eyes darting nervously to the shadows that seemed to dance around them. Tyler chuckled, brushing it off. "Probably just the wind. We're in the middle of nowhere, sophomore. The trees play tricks on you." But Sophie wasn't convinced. There was something about the way the wind whispered, like it was trying to tell them something. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Not truly. The night deepened, and the fire burned low, casting flickering shadows that seemed to shift and twist in the darkness. The whispering had grown more distinct, now clearly audible, though the words themselves were still unclear. Tyler, who had been trying to ignore the growing sense of unease, stood up and grabbed a flashlight. "I'm going to check out the forest a bit. Get some fresh air." Sophie hesitated, her hand reaching out to stop him. "Tyler, maybe we should just stay here. It feels wrong." Tyler smiled, the glint of excitement in his eyes. "Don't be such a worrywart. It's just a forest. I'll be back in a few minutes." Sophie. It was her name, spoken softly but urgently, as though it was a plea. She stood, her breath catching in her throat. But before she could take a step, the wind picked up again, carrying with it a low, hollow sound, almost like a distant scream. Suddenly, the fire sputtered out, plunging the camp into darkness. Tyler hadn't been gone long, but Sophie's fear began to escalate with each passing second. The forest seemed to close in around her, and every crackle of the branches in the wind sounded like footsteps, growing closer. "Sophie!" The whisper was now directly behind her, soft but insistent. She spun around, her flashlight flicking frantically through the trees, but there was nothing but the darkness. Her pulse quickened, and she called out, "Tyler? Is that you?" There was no answer, only the growing whispers that surrounded her now. The trees seemed to hum with life, their limbs creaking and groaning like ancient beings stretching after a long slumber. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't explain it, but she felt as though the forest itself was alive, watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She knew she had to find Tyler, had to get out of the woods. But the more she moved, the more the whispers seemed to guide her further into the heart of the forest. Meanwhile, Tyler had wandered deep into the woods, drawn by an inexplicable pull. The deeper he went, the more he felt as if something was guiding him, pushing him forward. The whispers were louder now, but they weren't words. They were like a song, an ancient, haunting melody that wrapped around him, making him feel like he had been here before. The trees towered over him, their twisted forms like grotesque sentinels, watching him with eyes that could not be seen. Tyler stopped in his tracks when he saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, just a shape that flickered at the corner of his vision. But as he turned toward it, he saw what it was, a figure standing among the trees. A tall man, cloaked in shadow, his face obscured. The man didn't move, didn't speak, but Tyler felt an overwhelming sense of recognition, like he had seen him before, long ago, in a dream or a nightmare. Who are you?" Tyler called out, his voice shaking despite his attempts to sound calm. The figure didn't answer. Instead, the forest around Tyler seemed to shift, the trees bending inward, as if closing off any escape. The whispers grew louder, their words clearer now. It was his name they were calling. Tyler. The figure stepped forward, and Tyler could see his face now. Hollow eyes. A twisted smile. He wasn't a man. He was something else entirely. Something born of the forest, of the dark heart that had been there long before the first settlers came. Something ancient, something hungry. "Welcome home," the figure whispered. Back at the campsite, Sophie had begun to panic. The darkness felt suffocating, and the whispers now felt like a physical presence, pressing in on her from all sides. She grabbed her backpack and turned toward the path where Tyler had gone, her feet stumbling over the roots of the trees as she tried to find him. She wasn't sure how long she had been walking, but it felt like hours. The forest was endless. Every direction looked the same, every tree the same twisted shape, the same oppressive darkness. Finally, she stopped, breathless, her heart racing. She couldn't do this. She couldn't stay here any longer. And then she heard it. The sound of someone, Tyler, calling her name. His voice was distorted, warped by the forest, but it was unmistakable. Sophie. She turned toward the sound, her eyes desperately scanning the darkness. Tyler. She called out, her voice trembling. And then, as if in answer, a figure emerged from the trees. At first, it looked like Tyler, tall, wearing the same jacket, the same worn boots. But as the figure stepped into the light, Sophie froze. It wasn't Tyler. His face was twisted and pale, his eyes hollow and dark, like the man in the forest. A smile stretched across his face, but it wasn't a smile of recognition. It was the smile of something that knew its prey. Tyler. She whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. Instead, he reached out, his hands unnaturally long, like branches from the trees. Sophie backed away, her heart hammering in her chest, but it was no use. The forest had claimed them both. By dawn, the whispers had stopped. The forest was silent again, and somewhere, deep within its shadows, the names continued to echo. Tyler, Sophie, Brian, Ellie, Grant, and the whispers promised, in their chilling song, we are not finished. The town of Oak Hollow was no more, swallowed whole by the insatiable hunger of the whispering woods. No one remained to remember its streets, its homes, its history. Time had passed, but the forest had not forgotten. It was an ancient force, older than any of the townspeople, older than the settlers, older than the myths. The forest lived, breathed, and waited, and still it was hungry. It was a crisp autumn morning when Alex and Marie, two local journalists, arrived in the area, intrigued by the rumors of a forgotten town. They had heard bits and pieces of the stories over the years, tales of disappearances, of whispers in the wind, of people driven mad by what they believed to be the cursed forest. Alex was skeptical, a man of logic, always looking for a scientific explanation. Marie, however, was a dreamer, someone who wanted to believe in the supernatural, to find the truths hidden in the shadows. Together, they thought they could solve the mystery that had long haunted the town. They had read about Oak Hollow, and about the strange events that had plagued the place for as long as anyone could remember. What better story could there be than to uncover the truth of a vanished town? Do you really think we'll find anything? Marie asked, looking out the car window as they drove along the overgrown path that had once been the main road leading into the town. The trees around them were thick and ancient, their branches twisting together like fingers reaching for the sky. Alex, glancing at her with a confident smile, said, probably just an abandoned settlement. Maybe some old photographs or newspapers. The usual stuff. Nothing supernatural. Marie wasn't so sure. The air felt thick with something she couldn't quite place, an unsettling presence that pressed against her chest. But she kept her doubts to herself. She had learned not to voice her fears in front of Alex. He never took her seriously when it came to things like this. They parked their car on the outskirts of the forest and made their way on foot. The path was barely visible, covered by the growth of wild plants and tangled roots. Despite the weight of the moment, the quiet of the woods wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive. Each step felt like a challenge, as though the forest itself was testing them. The further they ventured, the more it seemed like the trees closed in around them. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the silence was deafening. broken only by the occasional creak of branches or the distant rustling of leaves. But what unsettled Alex most was the feeling that someone was watching them. "Are you sure we should be this deep in?" Marie asked, her voice low and uncertain, her eyes scanning the trees nervously. "We're fine," Alex replied, trying to reassure her with a forced smile. "We just need to find some old buildings. Look for any signs of life." But it was clear that the further they went into the forest, the more the air around them thickened. There was something off about it, something unnatural, as if the trees themselves were alive and not in a peaceful way. Hours passed, and the forest only grew darker, as though the sun had been swallowed by the canopy above. The whispers began slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, just a faint sound on the edge of their hearing, so distant they thought they were imagining it. "Did you hear that?" Marie whispered, stopping in her tracks. Alex paused and looked around. "It's probably just the wind. There's nothing here." But the whispers came again, this time louder, more insistent. It sounded like a hum, a low, vibrating tone that seemed to come from the very earth beneath their feet. Alex frowned, brushing it off. He was trying to rationalize it, but Marie could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. "This isn't normal," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't like this." Alex took a deep breath and forced a smile, though he was beginning to feel the same unease creeping into his own chest. "Let's just keep going. We've come this far." They reached what appeared to be the remains of a town square. Stone foundations, rusted street signs, and what was left of a few crumbling homes. But something about it felt wrong, like the place itself had been forgotten, left to rot by time and nature. There were no animals, no birds, no signs of life. It was as though the entire town had been swallowed by the earth. Marie shivered. "This place feels wrong." Alex nodded. "Yeah, it's definitely creepy, but there's nothing supernatural here." As they explored the ruins, Marie's attention was drawn to a small, weathered photograph lying half buried in the dirt. She bent down and picked it up, her breath catching in her throat. It was a picture of a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. But it wasn't just any family. Marie recognized one of the faces. It was Ryan, one of the names she had read about in the old newspaper clippings. The same Ryan who had disappeared all those years ago, one of the first victims of the forest's hunger. "This can't be," Marie muttered, staring at the photograph in disbelief. Alex stepped closer, peering over her shoulder. He was about to make a sarcastic comment when his eyes widened. The man in the photo, Ryan, looked eerily familiar, but not from any history books. No, Alex realized with a sinking feeling. It was someone he had seen before. Someone in a dream, in a nightmare. "That's," he started to say, but his voice faltered. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't want to. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder than before, echoing through the ruins. The wind picked up, swirling around them, and the trees seemed to groan, bending and twisting in unnatural ways. The shadows between the buildings grew deeper, darker, as if something was waiting. Marie clutched the photograph in her hand, and for the first time, Alex saw the fear in her eyes. It was real. All the stories, all the warnings, they were true. The forest, the hunger, the whispers, it was all real. Then, as they both turned to leave, something caught their eye. A figure standing at the edge of the square, just out of the light. It was a man, but his face was obscured by shadows. His posture was rigid, and his presence was unervingly still. "Who's there?" Alex called, his voice shaking slightly. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, waiting. And then the whispering stopped. In the dead silence that followed, the man stepped forward, his face coming into view. It was Ryan. But it wasn't Ryan. Not anymore. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale and stretched tight over his skull. His smile was wide and unnaturally sharp, a twisted, grotesque thing. "You shouldn't have come here," he said in a voice that was both familiar and otherworldly. Marie's breath caught in her throat as Alex froze, unable to speak. The shadows behind Ryan shifted, and suddenly the forest seemed to come alive, the trees moving, the ground trembling. The whispers began again, louder now, filling the air with a sound that was both a warning and an invitation. Ryan's smile widened, and as his hand reached out, the darkness closed in. The forest had claimed them, too. Back at the edge of the woods, the whispers faded to silence once again. The only sound now was the soft rustling of leaves, the same sound that had haunted the people of Oak Hollow for so long. The forest stood as it always had, silent, still, and waiting. And still, it was hungry. The names would continue to be whispered, the souls would continue to be claimed, and the whispering woods would never be finished. The town of Oak Hollow was a place erased by time, yet its memory lingered in the undercurrent of the land, an ancient pulse that vibrated beneath the earth, beneath the roots of the forest. It had taken so much from the world, and still it hungered for more. But now a new presence had arrived, a presence unaware of the terrible force that lurked in the shadows. Jared and Ellie had heard the stories. Every local had, but unlike most, they were determined to uncover the truth. Both were fascinated by the supernatural, eager to unravel the mysteries of the world, to expose what lay beneath the surface of the everyday. They had heard about the whispering woods, about the cursed town, the strange disappearances, the unsettling whispers that echoed from the trees. They had been warned, of course, but those warnings only fueled their desire to know more. What could be so terrifying that people had vanished, never to be seen again? Jared, the skeptic, remained doubtful. "It's just a bunch of legends," he insisted. "People love to tell ghost stories, but that's all they are. Ghost stories." Ellie, on the other hand, was a believer. "There's more to it than that, Jared. There's something out there in those woods. You can feel it. People don't just disappear for no reason." It was early evening when they arrived at the edge of the forest. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The wind had picked up, whistling through the branches with an eerie, almost melodic sound. The air was thick with a foreboding silence that made Ellie's skin crawl. "Let's just get through the night and head back tomorrow," Jared suggested, pulling his jacket tighter against the growing chill. "We'll explore a bit, get some pictures, and then head home." Ellie nodded, though her heart wasn't in it. She had a nagging feeling in her gut that something was wrong. The atmosphere here was too heavy, too oppressive, as though the forest was watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. They set up their camp just beyond the tree line, the last rays of sunlight fading as they prepared a fire. Ellie kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes darting between the trees. The wind had died down, but the air still felt thick and alive, like the forest was holding its breath. "I don't know, Jared," Ellie said, her voice trembling. "This place isn't like the others. It feels wrong." Jared, ever the pragmatist, laughed and waved her off. "It's just a forest, Ellie. Let's not get carried away. We'll be fine. Trust me." But Ellie couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't just the silence. It was the stillness that hung in the air. Even the rustling leaves had quieted, as if the world itself had stopped moving. As darkness fell, the fire crackled and popped, throwing flickering shadows across their campsite. The woods were nearly pitch black beyond the circle of light, and the only sound was the occasional snap of a twig or the distant call of an owl. Ellie sat with her back to the fire, her eyes scanning the woods, her mind racing with doubts. Jared, ever the optimist, had settled into a comfortable silence, though his eyes, too, seemed to linger a little too long on the trees. They had both heard the stories of Oak Hollow, the town swallowed by the forest, the voices, the disappearances. They had come looking for answers, but as the darkness deepened, the questions only grew more pressing. "Jared," Ellie began, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you ever wonder if the stories are true?" Jared shrugged, unwilling to admit any unease. "I told you, it's just superstition. The people here are just afraid of the unknown. But there's nothing supernatural going on. Trust me." Just then, a sound broke the silence. Faint, but distinct. A rustling in the underbrush, followed by a low whisper, carried on the wind. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. The voice was clear, though it was too faint to make out the words. It sounded like someone was calling her name. "Ellie," the voice whispered. She froze. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too clear. Someone, or something, was out there, just beyond the reach of the firelight. "Did you hear that?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling. Jared looked up, his brow furrowing. "Hear what?" "The whispering," Ellie replied, her voice shaking. It called my name." Jared chuckled, though there was no humor in his tone. "You're imagining things. There's nobody out there. It's just the wind." But Ellie wasn't convinced. She had heard it, and it wasn't the wind. The voice was too clear, too personal. It was as if someone was standing just outside the circle of light, watching them, waiting. She stood up suddenly, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm going to check it out," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ellie, wait." But she was already moving, walking cautiously toward the trees. Jared hesitated for a moment, then followed her. The rustling in the underbrush had stopped, but the air still felt charged, thick with the whispers that seemed to be swirling just beyond the firelight. The deeper they ventured into the woods, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees were taller here, their twisted branches intertwining to block out the little light from the moon, leaving them in near total darkness. Every step seemed to echo in the silence, amplifying the unease that gnawed at Ellie's insides. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Jared asked, his voice low. "I have to know," Ellie replied, her voice shaking. "I have to know if we're really alone out here." As they walked further, the whispers grew louder, now a constant hum in the air, like a low chant that seemed to pulse from the very ground beneath their feet. Ellie felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, and in the sudden deafening silence, Ellie heard a sound that froze her blood. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind them. She whipped around, but the forest was empty. No one was there. "Jared," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Did you hear that?" Jared was standing still, his eyes wide, his breath shallow. I heard it." Before Ellie could respond, a figure emerged from the darkness. At first, it was just a shadow, a shape moving between the trees. But as it stepped into the dim light of the moon, they could see it clearly. It was a man, tall, gaunt, with skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were wide, empty, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque, unnatural smile. The figure stepped closer, and Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she recognized him. It was Ryan. But it wasn't Ryan, not anymore. His features were too twisted, too alien. He had the look of someone who had been lost to the forest, swallowed by it, consumed by whatever darkness dwelled within. "Ellie," Ryan whispered, his voice hollow, distant. It was as though the sound came from the very trees themselves, from the roots of the earth. "Ellie, come home." Jared stepped back, his face pale with terror. This isn't possible. But it was happening. The figure reached out, its fingers impossibly long, its hand like a claw. "Run," Ellie whispered, her voice cracking with fear. They turned and fled, their footsteps crashing through the underbrush, but the forest seemed to shift around them. The trees loomed larger, their branches twisting and turning, their shadows stretching toward them. The whispers were back now, louder, angrier. "Ellie, Jared." They were calling their names, pulling them deeper into the woods. And all around them, the forest waited. It had been hungry for so long, and now it had them. The next morning, the campsite was abandoned. No sign of Ellie or Jared remained, not even a trace of where they had gone. And the forest, as it always had, stood silent. But beneath the earth, beneath the roots of the trees, the whispers continued. And the hunger of the whispering woods was far from satisfied. The names would always be whispered, always. The forest had not changed. It never did. The trees still whispered their ancient secrets, their twisted limbs still clawed at the sky, and the wind continued its eerie song through the canopy. But deep within the woods, the hunger grew, ever relentless. The names of the lost, of those who had wandered too deep, echoed among the roots and shadows. And still, the forest waited. It had been months since Ellie and Jared vanished. News of their disappearance spread quickly, but as with all the others before them, there was no trace left behind. No bodies. No signs of struggle. Just empty space, consumed by the forest as if they had never existed. Life in the nearby town of Hollow Creek continued, though there was an unspoken tension in the air, a quiet understanding that the forest held sway over the land. It was a force that none could understand, nor defy. But not everyone had forgotten about the strange events that surrounded Oak Hollow. There were still those who believed in the curse, in the dark presence lurking in the trees. Among them was Lucas, a young man who had grown up hearing stories about the Whispering Woods, and his older sister Olivia, who had never quite believed the tales but had always felt uneasy around the forest. The two had lived in Hollow Creek all their lives, but had never ventured into the woods until now. Lucas, unlike many others, was determined to uncover the truth. "I'm going in," he told Olivia one chilly evening, his eyes gleaming with determination. "I have to know what happened to them, to Jared and Ellie, to all the others." Olivia, who had long been wary of the woods, hesitated. Lucas, I don't think it's a good idea. People go in there, and they don't come back. You've heard the stories. You know what happens." Lucas only smiled at her with a mix of arrogance and excitement. "That's just superstition. You can't let fear control you. I'm going to find out what's really going on, and I'll prove it." He packed a small bag, a flashlight, a map of the area, and a camera. He wasn't sure what he'd find, but he was determined to get to the bottom of it. After all, how could a whole town vanish without a trace? Something had to explain it. Olivia watched her brother with a mixture of concern and disbelief. She knew the risks. She knew the forest had a way of drawing people in, twisting their minds, making them forget who they were. The stories had always been passed down through whispers. Those who ventured into the woods often returned changed, or not at all. "I'll go with you," Olivia finally said, her voice tight with worry. "If you're really going, I'm not going to let you go alone." Lucas looked at her with a soft smile. "You don't have to come, Liv. I'll be fine. You can stay here, where it's safe." But Olivia wouldn't let it go. She had seen the way the forest had taken people, the way it had consumed Oak Hollow. If Lucas was going, she would follow, no matter the cost. And so, that evening, they set out together toward the forest's edge, the dying light of the sun casting long shadows across the land. The wind had picked up again, whistling between the trees, carrying a whisper that seemed to beckon them forward. The forest greeted them in silence. It felt colder here than it should have, and the air was thick, heavy with an unnatural stillness. The once familiar sound of crickets and rustling leaves was absent. The trees seemed to lean in close, their gnarled branches twisting like claws that threatened to snatch them up. "Stay close," Lucas said, his voice low as he glanced nervously at the trees. "We'll stick to the path. We won't get lost." But as they moved deeper into the woods, it was clear that the path was no longer a simple guide. It was an illusion. The trees closed in on them, their branches twisting overhead to form a canopy that blocked out most of the sky. The path itself seemed to shift beneath their feet, twisting in ways that defied logic. What had once been a simple trail now felt like a maze, a trap slowly closing in. "What the hell is happening?" Olivia whispered, her voice tight with panic. "I don't know," Lucas admitted, his heart pounding. "It wasn't like this when I came here before." The further they went, the more the air seemed to thicken. It wasn't just the oppressive silence. It was something else, something deeper. The whispers had started again, faint at first, then growing louder, as if 1,000 voices were speaking at once. They couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, a low, haunting hum that seemed to come from every direction. "Do you hear that?" Olivia asked, her eyes wide, her grip tightening on Lucas's sleeve. It's just the wind," Lucas said, though his voice wavered. He was beginning to feel it too, the sense that they were no longer alone in the forest. "We just need to keep moving." But the whispers only grew louder, more insistent. The trees creaked and groaned as if they were alive, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, the path changing with every step they took. The air grew colder, and the darkness deepened, swallowing them whole. And then, without warning, the figure appeared. It was a man, a tall figure, his form half hidden in the shadows of the trees. His face was pale, stretched tight over his bones, his eyes hollow and dark, his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, the skin pulled taut, making his smile appear too wide, too unnatural. "Who are you?" Olivia asked, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer. He simply stared at them, his eyes locked onto theirs, unblinking. And then the whispers came again, louder this time, circling around them like a swarm of insects. It was as though the very air was alive with the voices of the lost, the whispers of those who had wandered too far into the forest and never returned. "Ryan," Olivia whispered, her heart freezing in her chest. The face of the man before them was too familiar. It was Ryan, the man who had vanished long ago, one of the first to disappear. But this wasn't Ryan anymore. This was something else, something twisted and wrong. "We shouldn't be here," Lucas whispered, his throat dry. "This is where it all started." But it was too late. The figure moved toward them, its movement slow and deliberate, each step an echo in the silence. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and the trees seemed to shift, closing in around them. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them in a maddening chorus. The darkness of the forest pressed in on them, suffocating until there was no way out. "You came for the truth," the figure spoke, its voice low and guttural. "But the truth is not for you to know. The forest will claim you, as it has claimed all the others." With that, the figure lunged at them, and the world around them shattered into darkness. The next morning, Hollow Creek awoke to a fresh layer of fog rolling in from the woods. The air was thick, and the distant sound of the wind seemed to carry with it an unsettling hum, a sound that no one could explain. No one saw Lucas or Olivia again. They had gone into the forest, and the forest had taken them, just like the others before. And deep within the woods, where the trees whispered their eternal hunger, the names of the lost echoed on, waiting to be heard by the next unfortunate souls who ventured too far into the darkness. And the forest, it still waited. The village of Hollow Creek, once filled with whispers of old legends, had grown eerily silent. The forest, ever present at the village's edge, had become more than just a part of the landscape. It had become a symbol of the town's unspoken fear. People still passed through the village square, carrying on with their lives, but the air had grown heavy, suffused with a tension that was impossible to ignore. The disappearance of Lucas and Olivia was the latest in a long line of vanishing acts, but it was different this time. The forest was no longer just a place for ghost stories. It had claimed lives, left an indelible mark on Hollow Creek, and no one dared speak of it openly anymore. The old town had accepted the whispers, and now they had become a part of their everyday life. But not everyone in Hollow Creek had forgotten. Far from it. At the edge of the forest, the tall, crumbling building that had once been a home to the town's elders stood still, its windows cracked, its doors boarded up. The old archives of Hollow Creek had once been a place where stories of the past were preserved, but as the years passed, the archives had been neglected, forgotten by all except for one person, Eleanor. Eleanor had lived in Hollow Creek her entire life. She had seen the town grow and fade with the seasons. But unlike many others, she hadn't allowed herself to forget. She remembered the stories, the ones that the elders used to tell. She remembered the first whispers of the woods, how it started small but grew into something bigger, something insidious. Her grandmother had often told her of the older, darker days of the town, when it was known as Oak Hollow. She spoke of a curse, of an ancient power that had once controlled the land, its roots growing deep into the earth, twisting everything around it. Eleanor had heard the stories, but she had never truly believed them until recently, after hearing the accounts of the disappearances that had started with Ryan and continued to this day. And now, with Lucas and Olivia lost to the woods, Eleanor knew it was time to act. The air was thick with fog as Eleanor made her way into the old building. She had visited the archives many times, but tonight something felt different. The weight of the past seemed to press down on her more heavily than ever before. The stories whispered of something much older than the town itself. Something ancient. Something that had always been there, waiting. Inside the building, the air was cold and stale. The shelves that lined the walls were packed with dusty volumes, filled with the faded ink of generations past. Eleanor knew that somewhere in these shelves, buried under layers of forgotten time, lay the truth. She reached for an old leather-bound book, one that had been passed down through generations of town elders. The book's pages were brittle, the words barely legible, but Eleanor knew the significance of the text. Her grandmother had once told her it held the key, the truth about Oak Hollow and the forest's curse. As she opened the book, the musty scent of aged paper filled the air. The first few pages were filled with stories of Oak Hollow's founding, how the town had prospered in its early years. But as Eleanor flipped through the pages, the tone of the book began to shift. The stories grew darker, the ink more frantic. It spoke of a force deep in the woods, an ancient presence that fed on the souls of the lost, a power that had been there long before the town was founded, before even the trees had begun to take root. She skimmed over the words, her fingers trembling as she read aloud to herself. The forest calls to the lost. Its whispers are the voices of those who have strayed too far. It is the hunger of the earth, the longing of the trees to claim what is theirs. And those who enter will never return. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. She had heard these words before, spoken by the elders in hushed tones, in warnings meant to keep the children in line. But now they felt different. They felt real. The forest was alive, and it was calling to her. Flipping to the next page, Eleanor found a faded map of the old town, Oak Hollow, and the surrounding woods. At the center of the map, drawn in red ink, was a symbol, a twisted shape, an intricate design that seemed to move on the page. It was the same symbol she had seen in the woods, carved into the bark of the ancient trees. And then she found it, a passage buried deep in the pages, its words scrawled in hurried, panicked writing. Beware the roots. The trees speak to each other, and the earth listens. It is the roots of Oak Hollow that bind us, and the roots that will take us. The forest grows stronger with every life it claims. It is not just a place of death, but a place of rebirth. Those who are lost will return, but not as they once were. Eleanor felt a cold shiver run through her. The words seemed to burn into her mind, each one like a nail driven into her thoughts. She couldn't stop herself from reading on. The forest is not a place of trees. It is the embodiment of the curse that Oak Hollow has forgotten, but which the forest remembers. And it will never let go. The book suddenly felt too heavy in her hands. The truth was out there, hidden in the woods, waiting to be uncovered. But the more she read, the more she realized the forest wasn't just a place of darkness. It was a living thing. It fed on fear, on regret, on the memories of those who had been lost. The forest had been waiting for someone like her. It knew she would come. She slammed the book shut, her breath shallow and uneven. There was no more time. She had to go now. But as she turned to leave, something stopped her. A sound. A whisper. It came from deep within the building, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The air grew thick, as if something was stirring beneath the earth, calling to her. Eleanor's heart raced. She knew the sound. It was the whisper of the woods, calling her, pulling her toward the darkness. She couldn't resist it. She couldn't run from it. And just as she reached for the door, a cold hand wrapped around her wrist. Her breath caught in her throat. The hand was cold, its fingers long and bony, with skin stretched tight over its knuckles. She spun around, but there was no one there. Nothing but the oppressive darkness that filled the room. The whispers grew louder, and the door slammed shut behind her. The forest had found her. Back in Hollow Creek, life carried on as usual. The townspeople went about their daily routines, unaware of the dark forces that were once again stirring in the forest. But in the dead of night, a figure appeared at the edge of the woods, a shadow slipping between the trees. It was Eleanor, but she was not the same. Her eyes were wide, empty, vacant, and in her hand she held the book, now covered in a layer of fresh dirt, its pages torn and worn. She did not speak as she walked toward the village. Only the soft whisper of the trees could be heard, following her every step. The forest had claimed another soul, and the whispers, once again, called to the next. No one would ever be the same in Hollow Creek again. The morning after Eleanor's return to Hollow Creek was unlike any the town had ever known. The sky was thick with a strange, heavy fog that lingered well into the afternoon. The sun struggled to pierce through, casting an eerie, pale light over the cobblestone streets. The usual bustle of the market square was replaced by a silence that seemed unnatural, as if the very air itself had been frozen in time. Though the townspeople went about their usual routines, the sense of foreboding was undeniable. Whispers spread from house to house, stories of Eleanor's return from the woods, of her empty eyes and the strange, disquieting way she moved through the village. No one had seen her arrive. She simply appeared, walking from the forest's edge, her hands clasped tightly around the book that had once been hidden in the old archives. The villagers tried to go on with their lives, but every glance toward the woods sent a ripple of unease through them. They had lived in the shadow of the forest for generations, but something had shifted. Something darker, something far more insidious had taken root. Eleanor did not speak to anyone that day. She wandered the streets in a daze, as though she were not truly part of the town anymore. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she were walking through water, her mind far from the world around her. The townspeople whispered, but none dared approach her. When the sun set and the sky darkened, Eleanor finally found herself at the edge of the forest again. She stood there for a long time, staring at the trees, the whispers from within the woods calling to her, beckoning her back. She could hear them clearly now, the voices of the lost, the ones who had wandered too far and never returned. They spoke of the hunger that lived deep within the roots, of the ancient presence that had waited patiently for the right moment to claim its next victim. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the book. She knew the truth now. The forest was not just a place of death. It was something much older, something that had always been there, hidden beneath the soil, its roots stretching out like veins, pulling everything toward it. With a deep breath, Eleanor stepped into the woods. As she moved deeper into the forest, the fog grew thicker, the trees closing in on her. The path beneath her feet seemed to shift and twist, leading her in directions that made no sense. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it the faint voices of the lost. Their whispers were not kind. They were desperate, pleading for help, but there was no mercy in the forest. The air grew colder as she ventured deeper, the darkness swallowing everything in its path. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching down toward her, their twisted forms casting long, unnatural shadows. Then she saw them. Figures, shadows of people, standing in the distance, barely visible through the fog. Their eyes glowed faintly, their faces twisted in expressions of horror, their bodies gaunt and hollow. They were the lost, the ones who had disappeared over the years, their souls trapped in the forest, forever bound to its darkness. Eleanor felt their eyes upon her, their silent gaze piercing her soul. They whispered, their voices muffled by the wind, but she could hear the desperation in their tones. They were warning her, leave before it's too late. But Eleanor didn't listen. She couldn't. She was beyond the point of turning back now. The forest had already claimed her, just as it had claimed so many others. She had come for the truth, and now she would face whatever it was that lurked beneath the earth. She pushed forward, deeper into the heart of the woods, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches like hands, reaching, grasping, pulling her closer to the heart of the darkness. It wasn't long before she reached it, the center of the forest, a clearing shrouded in darkness, where the trees stood in a perfect circle, their trunks twisted in strange patterns. In the center of the clearing was a massive tree, its roots sprawling outward like the fingers of a monstrous hand, digging deep into the earth. It was ancient, older than the town, older than the land itself. The tree's bark was dark and cracked, and its branches stretched high into the sky, blocking out what little light remained. Eleanor stood there for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. This was what the whispers had led her to, the heart of the forest. The wind picked up, howling through the clearing, and the voices of the lost grew louder, their whispers now a deafening chorus, filling her mind with their cries. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the air grew thick with the smell of decay. And then, from the roots of the ancient tree, something stirred. A shape, dark and formless, began to rise from the ground. The earth cracked open as the shape emerged, a mass of shadows and writhing tendrils. It was as though the very forest itself was alive, its roots pulling itself out of the earth, forming a creature of darkness, something born from the soil and the whispers. Eleanor stood frozen, her body trembling. She could feel the weight of the forest's gaze upon her, as if it were watching her, studying her every move. The creature's eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed faintly in the dark, and its voice rumbled like thunder as it spoke. You sought the truth, but the truth is a curse. The forest claims all who seek to understand it. You are now part of the roots, part of the hunger. There is no escape. Eleanor felt the weight of the creature's words settle on her chest, pressing down, suffocating her. She had come seeking answers, but now she understood that there were no answers to be found in the forest, only endless darkness and hunger. The creature's tendrils reached out, wrapping around her, pulling her toward the ancient tree. Her body fought against the pull, but it was no use. The roots were stronger than her will. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the forest, lost among the whispers of the lost. And as her body was consumed by the earth, the forest grew darker, its roots spreading further, claiming more land, more souls. Back in Hollow Creek, the fog never fully lifted. The villagers spoke of Eleanor's disappearance, but they no longer ventured too close to the forest. They had seen what it could do. They had seen the change it wrought in those who sought its secrets. And so, the whispering woods remained, waiting, hungry. The lost would always find their way back. and the forest would always claim its due. You were always a part of it, it said, its voice soft but filled with a terrible certainty. You were drawn here for a reason. The house called you, and now you will stay. The shadows closed in around them, suffocating them, consuming them, as the figure's hand reached closer, closer. There was no escape, no hope, no salvation. The house had claimed them, and they were lost to it forever. The figure's hand touched Daniel's shoulder, cold as ice, sending a jolt of terror through him. But just as it did, something shifted in the air. A crack, faint but distinct, reverberated through the room. The house trembled. The shadows faltered. For a brief moment, there was a glimmer of something else. Something powerful, something that had not been there before. And in that moment, the house seemed to recoil, as if in fear. But before they could react, the darkness surged once more, swallowing everything. The last thing they heard was the voice of the figure, its tone cold and final. It is done. The darkness enveloped them completely, suffocating and impenetrable, a void that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Daniel and Sarah clung to each other, their breaths shallow, their bodies trembling under the crushing weight of the shadows. The house, or whatever this entity truly was, had bound them, trapping them in a prison where time and reality twisted endlessly, reshaping the world around them into a reflection of pure terror. They couldn't see, couldn't move, couldn't even scream. Their voices felt trapped within their chests, silenced by the overwhelming presence that had taken hold. It was as though they were submerged in a cold, inky abyss, a place where sound and light could not reach. Moments passed, or were they hours? Until something finally shifted. A faint glow, distant and dim, began to appear, cutting through the shadows. The light pulsed gently, like a heartbeat, and seemed to draw them forward, urging them deeper into the darkened space that no longer resembled the house they'd once entered. Despite their fear, the glimmer offered the only escape from the pressing blackness, and they moved toward it with desperate hope. As they walked, the ground beneath them softened, like walking through mud or thick tar. Their steps were slow, each movement dragging them further into an unknown depth. The light grew brighter, revealing faint shapes ahead, distorted, grotesque forms that seemed to writhe and twitch in the dim glow. Sarah gasped as one of the shapes came into focus. A figure bound in place, its form twisted and broken, its face contorted in a silent scream. The light illuminated more of these shapes as they moved closer, and the horror became clear. These were people, or what remained of them, souls trapped, their bodies distorted and fused to the walls around them, their eyes empty yet somehow filled with unspeakable pain. Daniel turned away, unable to look, his stomach twisting with revulsion and fear. "What is this place?" he muttered, though he knew there would be no answer. They moved cautiously, stepping past the trapped figures, feeling the pull of the light ahead. The air grew colder with every step, and the silence around them thickened, pressing in on their minds, filling them with an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if they were walking into the heart of the darkness itself, the core of whatever entity had ensnared them. The light became blinding, and as they finally reached its source, they froze. Before them stood the figure they had seen in the house, the tall, shrouded entity whose presence had haunted them since they first stepped inside. But now, in the stark glow, they could see its face, a hollow mask devoid of features, a face that was both human and monstrous, a face that seemed to shift and change with each heartbeat. The figure spoke, its voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to reverberate through their very bones. "You have come to the end," it said, its tone devoid of emotion. "You are part of the house now. part of me." Its hand reached out toward them, and this time they could not move, could not turn away. The shadows coiled around them, binding them in place, as the figure's hand touched their foreheads, cold as death, filling them with a sensation so dark and empty that they could hardly breathe. Visions flooded their minds, images of the house through time, of countless others who had entered and never escaped, of souls twisted and bound in eternal darkness. Daniel and Sarah felt their bodies growing heavy, their vision fading, as though they were being pulled into the shadows themselves, absorbed by the house and all its horrors. They struggled, tried to resist, but the pull was too strong, too overwhelming. The house's hunger was insatiable, its desire to consume absolute. They could feel their own memories slipping away, their sense of self dissolving, replaced by the dark, consuming presence of the entity. The last thing they saw was the figure's hollow, shifting face, its empty eyes staring back at them with a cold indifference. And then there was only darkness. The silence was suffocating. Daniel and Sarah were submerged in a void so deep it felt as if they'd been stripped of any essence of themselves, left drifting in a place beyond time and reality. They had no sense of their own bodies now, only an overwhelming emptiness that stretched in all directions, a darkness that pulsed faintly as though it held a heartbeat of its own. And yet, somewhere in the infinite black, a sound began to emerge, a distant, faint whisper that felt as though it was both inside and around them. It was a murmur, indistinct but filled with a chilling familiarity, and it grew louder, echoing through the hollow space, reverberating against their fading thoughts. Hollow Creek had become a place of quiet mourning, where the villagers had learned to live with the shadow of fear looming over them. The disappearances, the strange occurrences, the whispers from the woods, these were no longer just stories. They were the fabric of their reality. And each day, the tension in the town grew, a collective awareness of the inevitable. No one dared to venture into the forest anymore. It was an unspoken rule, one that everyone had come to understand, even if they could never explain it fully. But there were still those who refused to believe, those who felt the pull of the unknown, who couldn't accept that the town had been swallowed by the curse of the Whispering Woods. Among them was a young man named Thomas. Thomas had grown up hearing the stories that filled the cold nights with fear, that made the walls seem thinner and the shadows longer. But he had never believed in them. He had always thought it was a way to control the children, a means of keeping them safe and out of trouble. But now, with Eleanor gone, with the whispers growing louder every night, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. His curiosity began to take root. The more the villagers whispered about the woods, the more he felt an undeniable pull toward them. He had known Lucas, Olivia, and Eleanor, and he couldn't accept their fates. There had to be more to the story. There had to be an explanation. One evening, after the last remnants of sunlight had faded from the sky, Thomas stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the darkness. The wind rustled the leaves, and the distant call of an owl echoed through the trees. He could feel it, the presence of something watching him from the depths of the woods, just beyond his reach. But Thomas wasn't afraid. His mind was made up. Tonight, he would enter the forest, and he would find out what had taken his friends. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry leaves that covered the ground. The air was thick with moisture, and the smell of earth and decay was strong, as though the very ground beneath him was alive. The further he walked, the darker it became, until the last glimmers of moonlight were swallowed by the dense canopy above. The deeper Thomas ventured, the more the world around him seemed to shift. The trees grew taller, their trunks twisted in unnatural ways, their branches bending toward him as though reaching out to touch him. The path he walked on grew indistinct, disappearing into the underbrush, as though the forest itself was intent on hiding the way. And then it came, the whisper. At first, it was faint, a soft murmur carried on the wind, like the rustling of leaves. But then it grew louder, clearer. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he could feel the desperation, the pull. It was as though the forest itself was calling to him, urging him to go deeper. Come closer. Come closer. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He had heard stories of the whispers, but hearing them now, feeling them crawl into his mind, was something entirely different. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and the air grew thick and oppressive. We are here. We have been waiting. The voices were not human. They were too old, too twisted. And yet, they felt familiar, like the echo of something long forgotten. Something deep in his mind stirred, a memory, a flicker of recognition. But before he could grasp it, the whispering stopped, leaving him in an unsettling silence. Thomas stood still, his breath shallow. Something was wrong. He couldn't explain it, but he could feel it. Something was waiting for him, watching him. He turned, scanning the trees around him, but there was nothing. Only the endless dark of the forest, its eyes hidden behind the shadows. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled. The trees shook, their branches rustling like a distant storm. Thomas stumbled, falling to his knees as the earth shifted beneath him. He looked up, and his heart stopped. From the shadows, a figure emerged. A tall, thin figure, its face hidden beneath a hood. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as though it were part of the forest itself. It was impossibly still, its presence both commanding and terrifying. The whispers returned, louder now, reverberating through the air, filling Thomas's mind with their clamoring voices. You should not have come here, Thomas. The figure spoke, its voice a low, gravelly rasp that sent a chill down his spine. He tried to move, but his body refused to obey. The figure stepped closer, its presence pressing in on him like a suffocating weight. The air around him grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, swirling around him in a cacophony of voices. We are the forgotten, the lost, the ones who never left. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as the figure drew closer, its hollow, empty eyes staring down at him. The figure's face remained hidden, but he could feel its gaze, cold, unfeeling, like the abyss itself. Why are you here? Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible over the whispers. His fear gripped him, but he forced himself to speak. The figure tilted its head, as though considering the question. The whispers seemed to pause for a moment, as if waiting for an answer. Finally, the figure spoke again, its voice softer now, though still filled with an unsettling calm. Because the forest calls to you, Thomas. You too are part of it now. You have always been. The words sent a shock through him, and his body trembled. It was as though the ground beneath him had just fallen away, and he was plummeting into an abyss of darkness and despair. The figure's words rang in his ears, reverberating through his very soul. You came here seeking answers, but the answers were always here, waiting in the roots. Before Thomas could respond, the figure extended a long, bony hand, and a wave of cold rushed through him, filling his chest with a hollow ache. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body was paralyzed. as though the very air was thick with a force that held him in place. The whispers rose again, growing louder, more frantic. The figure's face was no longer hidden by a hood. It was the face of someone he knew, someone he had seen countless times in Hollow Creek. It was Lucas, or at least it looked like Lucas. His eyes were wide, empty, hollow, a reflection of the same emptiness that Thomas had seen in Eleanor's eyes when she returned. The figure that stood before him wasn't Lucas, of course. It was something else. Something born from the forest. A twisted reflection of the soul that had once been human. You are the one who is lost, Thomas. You belong to the forest now. And then the ground beneath him gave way. The earth opened, its roots stretching upward like fingers, pulling him into the darkness. His last breath caught in his throat as the forest consumed him, the whispers growing louder, filling every part of him. Back in Hollow Creek, the villagers awoke to the sound of rain pouring from the sky. But it wasn't just the rain that they heard. Somewhere in the distance, in the deep, dense forest, they could hear the whispers, the ones that had once claimed their loved ones. And they knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before the woods came for them too. The forest had not forgotten, and it would never let go. It was waiting. The whispering woods had claimed another soul. Hollow Creek had always been a quiet town, tucked away from the prying eyes of the world, hidden beneath the dense canopy of trees that surrounded it. But ever since the disappearances had begun, the town had felt different. The once familiar paths felt like haunted trails, the faces of the townspeople more drawn and anxious, their eyes constantly shifting toward the forest. No one spoke it aloud, but they all shared the same unspoken truth. The forest was alive, and it was waiting for them. With Thomas now missing, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The villagers could hear them in their dreams, feel them in the air. There was no escape. They had become prisoners of their own fear, their own silence, and the creeping dread that something was growing inside the whispering woods. It was only a matter of time before it would come for them all. The night was thick with fog, the moon barely visible through the clouded sky. A cold wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echoes of the lost souls who wandered the forest's depths. But tonight, something was different. The air felt charged with an unnatural energy, as though the forest itself was about to awaken in full force. The villagers could sense it, an anticipation that had been building for days, ever since Thomas's disappearance. In the center of Hollow Creek, at the old inn by the river, a meeting was taking place. A small group of villagers had gathered, all weary, all afraid. Among them were a few familiar faces: Olivia's older brother, Samuel, Eleanor's cousin, Rachel, and Thomas's close friend, Henry. They sat in the dimly lit room, their eyes darting toward the door, as though they feared someone, or something, would walk in at any moment. "I think we've all known this was coming," Samuel said, his voice low but firm. He ran a hand through his dark hair, his face etched with worry. The disappearances, the whispers, it's all connected. We can't keep ignoring it. Rachel nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. But what are we supposed to do? The forest. It's not like anything we understand. None of us even know what it is, or why it's taken them. She looked up at Samuel, her eyes pleading. "I don't want to lose anyone else." Henry, sitting quietly in the corner, finally spoke up. His voice was quiet, but it carried an edge of urgency. We need to end it. Whatever it is that's in there, it has to be stopped. We've let it grow too powerful. We tried before, Samuel reminded him, his tone grim. The elders, they went in years ago, long before any of us were born, and none of them ever came back. Rachel shuddered at the thought. She had heard the stories as a child, the tales of brave men and women who had entered the forest to uncover its secrets, only to disappear without a trace. They were not the first to suffer at its hands, and they wouldn't be the last. But if we don't try, Henry pressed on, his eyes burning with determination, then we'll be next. The forest doesn't stop. It doesn't care who you are or how long you've lived here. It takes what it wants. The room fell into a heavy silence. They all knew the truth of his words. They had seen it with their own eyes. Eleanor, Lucas, Thomas, and countless others who had disappeared without warning, without a trace. The woods had claimed them, one by one, and no one had dared to challenge it. "I'm going," Samuel said after a long pause, his voice steady. "We'll go together. We'll find out what's really going on. Maybe we can end this before it takes anyone else." He looked at Henry and Rachel, his eyes firm. "Are you in?" Henry met his gaze, his face pale but resolute. "I'm in." Rachel hesitated, her mind racing, her heart thumping in her chest. She didn't want to go into the forest. She didn't want to face whatever evil had claimed her cousin, but she knew there was no choice. She had to do this for Eleanor, for Thomas, for everyone. "I'll go," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll go if it means we can stop it." The three of them set out that night, armed with little more than their resolve and the knowledge of the forest's eerie, unpredictable paths. They didn't know what they would find, but they had no other choice. The town, the people they loved, were all at the mercy of the forest, and it was up to them to break the cycle. As they approached the edge of the woods, the temperature seemed to drop. The fog had thickened, rolling in from the forest like a living thing. The trees stretched out before them, dark and twisted, their branches swaying in the wind. They could feel the weight of the forest's gaze, as if the very trees were watching them, judging them, waiting for them to make a mistake. Hay stepped into the forest, and the world around them changed instantly. The air grew thick and damp, the ground soft beneath their feet. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled roots reaching out like twisted fingers. The path they followed was barely visible, obscured by the dense underbrush, and yet they knew they had no choice but to press on. For hours, they trudged through the dark, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of a branch or the distant rustle of leaves. The deeper they went, the heavier the atmosphere became. It felt as though the forest itself was alive, its pulse echoing in the ground beneath their feet, a constant reminder of the danger they faced. They hadn't spoken much, save for quick whispers and urgent glances. There was no need for words. The terror in their hearts was shared. It was a fear they couldn't escape, a dread that clung to them like a second skin. They had no idea where they were going or what they would find, but they had to keep moving. The forest was patient, it was relentless, and they had no time to waste. As they reached a small clearing, the ground beneath their feet shifted. The earth trembled ever so slightly, the air thickening with a sense of wrongness. They stopped, their eyes darting around the clearing, seeking any sign of life, any hint of what was happening. And then they heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rustling of the leaves. but it grew louder, clearer, until it filled the air around them, echoing off the trees, invading their thoughts. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was low, almost a growl, and it came from all around them. There was no place to hide, no place to run. The forest had already claimed them. The ground beneath their feet shook violently, and the clearing seemed to come alive. The trees creaked and groaned as if they were waking from a deep slumber, their roots twisting and reaching upward. Samuel, Henry, and Rachel stumbled backward, their hearts racing as the forest began to close in on them. "Run!" Samuel shouted, his voice filled with panic. But it was too late. From the shadows, figures began to emerge. Pale, gaunt forms, their eyes wide and empty, their bodies twisted and unnaturally thin. They were the lost, the ones who had disappeared before them, and they were coming for them now, drawn to the three who had dared to step into the heart of the whispering woods. As the figures closed in, their hollow eyes fixated on Rachel, Henry, and Samuel, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The forest had awoken, and it would never let them leave. The figures moved closer, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. Their hollow eyes, once human, now reflected the darkness of the forest, and their mouths hung open, as if they had forgotten how to speak but still carried the echoes of words long lost. Rachel's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest as she stared at the approaching figures. Henry gripped her arm tightly, his face pale, his eyes wild with fear. Samuel, ever the leader, stepped forward, his hands trembling but his voice steady. "Stay back," he ordered, but his voice lacked the authority it once had. It felt fragile, lost in the oppressive air of the forest. The first figure reached out, its fingers long and skeletal, and Rachel recoiled, but it was too late. Its cold hand brushed against her arm, and an icy chill spread through her body, sinking deep into her bones. The moment it touched her, the whispering grew louder, a deafening rush of voices that echoed in her mind, each one pleading, begging, crying for release. "They came for us. Now they come for you. Forever bound to the woods." Samuel drew his knife from his belt and lunged at the figure, slashing at its thin, brittle form. The blade passed through it as if it were made of smoke, and the figure didn't even flinch. It merely tilted its head, its hollow eyes locking onto Samuel with an unsettling, vacant gaze. "Get away from her," Samuel shouted, but his voice wavered, the desperation creeping in. Henry, his face contorted in fear, pulled Rachel back, stumbling toward the edge of the clearing. But the forest seemed to move with them. The trees creaked and groaned, their branches twisting in impossible angles, as if the woods itself was reshaping to trap them. The ground beneath them gave way, roots springing up to block their path. The once familiar path now felt like a maze of shifting shadows and dark whispers. The figures continued their relentless approach, each one gliding forward without making a sound, their gaunt bodies flickering in and out of sight as if they were part of the very air. The whispering filled the air, growing more urgent, more frenzied. "You can never leave. We will never let you leave." Henry's grip tightened on Rachel's arm as they backed away, his face pale and drenched in sweat. He could feel it too, the suffocating presence of the forest, the weight of its ancient power. They were caught. There was no way out. The forest had claimed them. "We need to," Samuel began, but his voice trailed off as he saw something in the distance. A shape, moving in the darkness between the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its figure was shrouded in shadow. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The whispering stopped, and even the figures paused, as if acknowledging the new presence. The tall shadow stepped forward, its silhouette slowly becoming clearer, and they saw it, a man, or what had once been a man, his eyes hollow and empty, his skin stretched tight over his bones. Lucas. Rachel whispered, her voice breaking. It was Lucas, or at least it looked like him. The same angular face, the same dark hair, but his eyes were empty, devoid of any life, as though whatever had been Lucas had long since vanished. His lips parted, and the whispering returned, now coming directly from his mouth. You are not meant to leave. None of us are. We are bound to the forest, just as you will be. Rachel's knees buckled beneath her, and she fell to the ground, overwhelmed by the sight of her old friend, now nothing more than a twisted reflection of what he had once been. Tears welled up in her eyes as she reached out, her voice trembling. Lucas, please, you have to remember us. You have to fight it. But Lucas didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. As he approached, his figure seemed to shift, distorting, as though his very essence was being twisted and reshaped by the forest's power. His hands reached toward Rachel, his fingers long and thin, his grip unyielding as he touched her arm. In that moment, Rachel felt it, a sharp, cold ache spreading through her veins, as though his touch was drawing something from her. The world around her began to spin, the trees and the figures blurring together into a single, nightmarish entity. The whispering grew louder, the voices of the lost ones filling her head until she could no longer distinguish them from her own thoughts. You belong here now. You belong to the forest. Her body went rigid as the cold crept deeper into her chest. She gasped for air, but it felt as though the very atmosphere was suffocating her. The forest had her, its grip tightening around her heart, pulling her closer to the abyss. But then, through the haze of darkness and fear, a voice broke through, Samuel's voice, shouting her name. Rachel, he cried, his voice strained with panic. You have to fight it. We need to get out of here now. Samuel rushed forward, his knife raised high, and with all his strength, he swung it at the figure of Lucas. The blade sank into the figure's chest, but instead of blood, it was as though the knife passed through a shadow. Lucas's body flickered, and for a moment, he disappeared into the air, leaving behind only a chilling echo of his whisper. You cannot escape. We will follow you. Samuel's eyes widened in horror as he realized that the forest was not just alive. It was conscious, aware of their every movement, and it would never let them go. The woods had a will of its own, a hunger that was insatiable, and once you stepped inside, you became part of it. But Rachel didn't have time to process that. Her vision was growing dim, her body growing weak as the forest's cold seeped deeper into her being. She tried to stand, tried to fight, but her limbs felt heavy, her mind clouded. Henry was pulling her, dragging her back toward the edge of the clearing, but the figures were closing in. The forest was closing in. They had no chance. Samuel's shout rang out one last time, filled with despair. We can't run anymore. Rachel looked up, her eyes blurry, but she saw it. At the edge of the clearing, a figure stepped forward. This one was different. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a lost soul. It was someone alive, someone from the village. It was Eleanor. Her clothes were tattered, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes empty like Lucas's. But there was something else, a flicker of recognition, a spark of something that wasn't entirely lost. Eleanor's lips moved, but it was not her voice that came out. The forest has already chosen you. And then, the world around Rachel went dark. The world around Rachel collapsed into darkness. The last thing she felt was the cold, grasping hands of the forest, pulling her deeper into its ancient, suffocating embrace. There were no more voices, no more whispers, just the suffocating void. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, as if she were floating in a space where nothing could touch her, not even her own thoughts. But then, something shifted. A crack of light, faint but persistent, cut through the darkness like a sliver of hope. Rachel's eyes fluttered open, her vision blurry. She was no longer in the clearing. She was lying on the ground, but not in the forest, not in the place where the figures had surrounded her. She tried to move, but her body felt heavy, as though it didn't belong to her. The air smelled different here. It wasn't the damp, decaying scent of the forest. This place was cold, dry, and smelled faintly of something sweet, like old flowers. A soft breeze rustled in the distance, carrying with it a sense of peace that felt strange after the terror of the woods. She struggled to sit up, her muscles protesting as she did so, and blinked rapidly, trying to focus. Her surroundings came into view slowly, revealing a large, open space, a clearing, but unlike any she had seen before. The ground beneath her was soft, almost cushion-like, covered in a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves. The trees here were tall, their trunks smooth and white, their branches reaching upward, but unlike the twisted, gnarled trees of the Whispering Woods, these appeared calm, almost peaceful. Rachel's heart raced in her chest. This place felt wrong, despite the apparent serenity. It was too quiet. She couldn't hear the distant rustling of the forest. There were no sounds of creatures, no whispering wind. The stillness was unnerving, as if the world had paused for a moment, waiting for something to happen. "Where am I?" she whispered to herself, her voice hoarse and trembling. As she scanned the clearing, she saw something, a figure standing in the distance, just beyond the trees. At first, she thought it might be one of the lost souls, one of the figures that had surrounded her in the forest. But as the figure drew closer, her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a shadow, nor was it a specter. It was a person. Eleanor. The sight of her friend brought a rush of conflicting emotions. She was alive. There was no mistaking it. But the woman who stood before her was not the Eleanor Rachel had known. She was gaunt, her face hollow and pale, her eyes dark and empty, much like Lucas's had been. Her clothes hung loosely on her thin frame, as though they no longer fit her. The image of her friend was unsettling. Yet a small part of Rachel felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps Eleanor had found a way out of the forest, just as she had. But then Rachel saw it. The faintest flicker in Eleanor's eyes, a brief moment of recognition, before it faded into emptiness once again. Her mouth opened, but the words that came out were not her own. "The forest calls to you, Rachel. It calls to all of us." Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she took a step back. "Eleanor, what happened to you?" "To all of you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Eleanor's hollow eyes locked onto her, and for the briefest moment, Rachel saw something human, deep within them. It was a flicker, barely noticeable, but it was there. Eleanor's lips parted again, but her voice was not her own, not anymore. "It's too late for us, Rachel. It's already chosen you. There's no escaping it." The ground beneath Rachel seemed to tremble, and she could feel it, an overwhelming sense of dread spreading through the air. It was as though the forest itself was aware of their presence, watching them, waiting for them to succumb to its will. Eleanor took a step forward, her movements slow, deliberate, her arms outstretched as if beckoning Rachel toward her. "Come," she said softly, her voice an eerie blend of the woman Rachel had once known and something far darker, more ancient. "Come closer. The forest is waiting. It wants you, just as it wanted the others." Rachel's body stiffened, and her mind screamed for her to run, to get away from this twisted version of her friend, but her legs wouldn't move. Fear rooted her to the spot as Eleanor's figure loomed closer, her eyes never leaving Rachel's. But just as Eleanor was almost upon her, something changed. A deep, thunderous sound echoed from the distance, shaking the very air around them. The earth trembled violently, and Rachel's vision blurred once more. It was as though the very foundation of the world was cracking apart. Eleanor froze, her eyes flickering for a moment, the strange calm fading from her face. A low, guttural noise vibrated from deep within the ground, like the groan of something immense waking from a long slumber. "No," Eleanor whispered, her voice faltering. "Not now." Rachel's pulse raced as the ground began to crack beneath her. The trees shook violently, their branches swaying as if caught in a great storm. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, now echoing from the very earth itself. "It's coming. It's too late." Suddenly, the ground split open, and from the darkness below, a massive figure emerged. Something monstrous, something ancient. Its shape was indistinct at first, shrouded in shadow, but the moment it fully emerged, Rachel gasped. The creature that stood before her was like nothing she had ever seen. Its form was shifting, constantly changing, as if it were made of the very darkness that surrounded them. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and twisting, its face a void of nothingness. It seemed to pulse with an ancient, terrible power, and as it moved toward her, the earth trembled beneath its weight. "Get away from it!" Eleanor screamed, her voice breaking. "You don't understand. It's the forest. It's the heart of it, the reason for all the whispers. It controls everything." Rachel could barely breathe, fear tightening its grip around her chest. She tried to move, to run, but her body refused to obey. The creature loomed closer, its hollow, empty eyes fixed on her, and the whispering grew louder, becoming a roar that filled the air, the voices of the lost souls now deafening in her ears. "You are mine now," the creature's voice rumbled, not from its mouth, but from the very ground, from the air, from the trees themselves. It was everywhere, a force that could not be denied. And then, in that final horrifying moment, Rachel realized the truth. The forest didn't just want her, it needed her. She wasn't a visitor here. She was a part of it, a piece of something ancient, something far more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. The whispering woods had claimed her, and there would be no escaping its dark embrace. Rachel's mind raced as the creature loomed closer, its presence suffocating. The air felt thick with its power, oppressive and unyielding. The ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse with each step the creature took, as if it was alive, feeding off her fear. Her body trembled, her breath shallow, but it was as if time had slowed, leaving her trapped in a moment of pure, unrelenting terror. The whispering had transformed into a deafening cacophony, the voices of the lost souls, twisted and anguished, swirling around her in a maddening frenzy. She could no longer distinguish one voice from another. only a collective wail that seemed to claw at her mind. It was the sound of despair, the sound of those who had come before her, who had been taken by the forest and its monstrous heart. The creature's eyes, if they could be called eyes, fixed on her, empty and all-consuming. There was nothing human about them, no trace of compassion or understanding. It was a force of nature, something born of darkness and fear, older than the forest itself. And it was here to claim her. Rachel stumbled backward, but the ground beneath her cracked and split open, roots and earth twisting around her ankles, pulling her down. Her screams were swallowed by the roar of the creature's voice, and her body was dragged forward, inch by agonizing inch, toward its terrifying presence. "You belong to the forest now," the creature growled, its voice like 1,000 whispers blended into one. "There is no escape. You will become like the others. You will be part of the endless cycle." Her heart hammered in her chest, and she felt the overwhelming weight of the creature's words. There was no hope, no chance for survival. She could feel it now, the pull of the forest, the call to join it, to become one of its lost souls. The temptation to give in, to let go of the fight, was powerful, but deep down, Rachel knew she couldn't. Not yet. But then, something shifted. A spark of defiance, a flicker of something deep within her, pushed through the fear. The memories of her friends, of the people she had known, Henry, Samuel, Lucas, and even Eleanor, flashed in her mind. She remembered their voices, their laughter, their courage. She wasn't alone. They were still here, somewhere inside her, and they would never give up. Rachel took a shaky breath, and her hand instinctively reached for the pendant around her neck, the one her mother had given her when she was a child. It was a simple silver pendant, an old family heirloom, but in that moment, it felt like a lifeline. The pendant had always been a source of comfort, a reminder of her roots, of the love that had shaped her life. And now, it felt like a connection to the world outside this nightmare. The creature paused, its dark gaze shifting toward the pendant, as if it sensed the shift in Rachel's spirit. Its form flickered, as though uncertain for the first time, its immense power wavering for a brief moment. The air seemed to grow colder, the earth beneath them trembling with an intensity that Rachel could feel deep in her bones. It was afraid. Rachel took another step back, pulling her hand away from the pendant and holding it firmly in front of her. She focused on it, on the strength it symbolized. She wasn't just fighting for her own survival. She was fighting for the souls of those who had been lost to this forest, for her friends, for everyone who had been consumed by its darkness. And she wouldn't let them down. Not now. "Leave me alone," she whispered, her voice hoarse but steady, the words carrying a weight that felt almost unnatural in this place of fear and shadow. "I will not be your prisoner." The creature recoiled, its form shifting violently, as if it were being struck by an unseen force. The ground beneath Rachel's feet began to crack open, and the roots that had held her fast released their grip, pulling back into the earth. The creature roared, a sound so terrible that the very trees around them seemed to shudder in response. For a moment, Rachel stood still, the tension in the air so thick that it felt like the world itself had stopped turning. The creature's dark form swayed, as though it were struggling to maintain its shape, to hold its power over her. The whispering voices had grown silent, replaced by a deep, pulsing hum that vibrated through the ground and into Rachel's chest. And then, something miraculous happened. The first tree, one of the towering white trees that surrounded the clearing, began to bend, its branches twisting as though it were being pulled by some invisible force. The other trees followed suit, their trunks cracking and groaning as they twisted and turned, their branches reaching toward the creature like arms, like hands. It was as if the forest itself was rejecting the creature, pushing back against the darkness that had claimed it for so long. The creature howled in fury, its form flickering between dimensions, its shape growing more distorted with each passing second. It was losing its grip, its hold on the forest and on Rachel. "Now," Rachel cried, her voice raw, the strength in her words surprising even herself. The forest seemed to respond to her command. The roots of the trees rose from the ground, wrapping themselves around the creature's limbs, pulling it backward, away from her. The air grew thick with the scent of burning wood as the creature's form writhed and screamed in agony. The forest, once a prison, was now fighting for her, for its own survival. Rachel stumbled backward as the creature's shape began to disintegrate, turning into a cloud of dark smoke and shadow that was torn apart by the force of the trees. She watched, breathless, as the creature was swallowed by the forest, its scream echoing in the distance as it faded into nothingness. The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, as the weight of what had just happened settled over her. The forest had won. The creature was gone, but so much had changed. The forest was alive, more alive than she had ever realized, and it had its own will, its own power. But she had resisted. She had fought back. The trees slowly returned to their original positions, their branches returning to their natural, peaceful state. The air felt lighter, as though the dark presence that had loomed over them for so long had been lifted. But Rachel knew that the forest was not free. The creature's hold might be gone, but it was not the end. She had only one for now. The stillness of the clearing was broken by a faint rustling sound behind her. Rachel turned quickly, her heart still racing, and saw someone emerging from the shadows of the trees. At first, she thought it was another of the lost souls, but as the figure stepped into the light, she recognized him. It was Henry. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice hoarse but full of relief. You did it." Rachel could hardly believe her eyes. He was alive. He had made it through. Tears welled up in her eyes as she ran toward him, throwing her arms around him in a desperate embrace. They had survived. They had fought the darkness, and they had won. But Rachel knew deep down that the forest would never let go completely. It had claimed so many before them, and it would try again. But they had found their strength. Together, they could face whatever was to come. For now, the forest was quiet, its whispers fading into the distance. But Rachel knew one thing for certain: it was not over. Rachel held onto Henry tightly, as if by doing so, she could anchor herself to reality. His presence was a beacon of light in the aftershock of everything they had just experienced. The dark force that had loomed over the forest had been momentarily defeated, but she could still feel the weight of its presence, lurking just beneath the surface. Her pulse was slow but steady, her body shaking not from fear, but from the exhaustion that had built up from the endless hours of terror. She had fought the forest. She had won, for now. How are you here?" she whispered, pulling back slightly to look at him. His face was pale, eyes sunken with exhaustion, but he was here, alive, just as he had been before. But there was something different in the way he looked at her, a depth to his eyes, a hint of something darker and far more unsettling. Henry's lips parted, but it took him a moment to speak, his voice rough, as though he were still trying to make sense of his own thoughts. I don't know. I thought I was done for," he said, looking around nervously. his gaze flickering to the shifting trees. When I saw that creature, I thought it was the end. But then, I don't know. Everything went black, and when I woke up, I was here. Rachel studied him, a chill running down her spine. He was here, yes. But there was a strange hesitation in his words, a disconnect between his body and the way his mind seemed to be processing the events. It reminded her of the way Eleanor had acted when they first encountered her in the forest. Distant, not entirely herself. "Henry," she said slowly, her heart pounding as she stepped back just enough to look him in the eyes. Are you really you?" He blinked, clearly taken aback by the question. "What do you mean?" "Of course I am." But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The quiet in the clearing, the air still heavy with the aftermath of the battle with the creature, made her feel as though the ground beneath her feet could crack open at any moment. A rustling in the trees caught her attention, pulling her gaze toward the shadows. She stiffened, her breath catching. The wind had shifted, and now she could hear something else. Voices, low and indistinct, barely audible above the breeze. They were whispers again, but not the same ones she had heard before. These voices sounded familiar. It wasn't just the forest. It was something else, something she hadn't noticed before. Something that had always been there, but she had only just become aware of it. The whispers had returned, but now they weren't calling to her. They were calling to Henry. "Henry," Rachel whispered urgently, grabbing his arm. "Do you hear that?" He stared at her, his face blank for a moment. Then his eyes widened. What is that?" he asked, looking around nervously, his hand instinctively reaching out as if to protect himself from the unseen presence. The whispers grew louder, the voices becoming clearer, but they were not speaking words. They were sounds, emotions, fragments of memories, lost and forgotten. They sounded like people Rachel had known, friends, family, but their voices were wrong, twisted and distorted by something dark and ancient. "Henry, come back." Rachel's heart stopped in her chest. She recognized that voice. It was Eleanor. The words were laced with desperation, and it was as if Eleanor was calling out to Henry specifically. Her voice filled with sorrow and longing. It was the same voice she had heard in the forest, but now it seemed to have a new purpose, a new target. The figure of Henry stiffened, his expression blanking as he slowly turned his head toward the trees. His eyes lost focus for a moment, as though he were hearing something Rachel couldn't. "Henry, don't listen to them," she cried, shaking him urgently. "You can't trust the forest. It's not her. It's not Eleanor." But it was too late. Henry's gaze softened, and before Rachel could stop him, he began to step toward the trees, his movements slow, deliberate. The whispers were growing louder, a chorus of voices calling to him, urging him to come closer. "No," Rachel whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. "Henry, please." But he didn't stop. The pull was too strong. He was being drawn into the forest, into the very heart of the darkness that had nearly consumed them all. In a desperate attempt to save him, Rachel ran after him, her feet stumbling over the uneven ground. "Henry, stop, please," she cried out, but her voice was drowned out by the rising intensity of the whispers, which now seemed to come from every direction, filling the air with their maddening call. As she reached out for him, her hand brushed his arm, but there was no response. His body felt cold, almost lifeless, as if something inside him had already been lost. His eyes were vacant, staring ahead as if he were already somewhere else, somewhere far from her. "Henry," Rachel cried, her voice breaking as she shook him harder. But it was like trying to wake a sleepwalker from a dream. He was lost to her, lost to the forest. In that moment, the truth became clear to Rachel. The creature, the forest, it was not just a force of nature, not merely an ancient evil. It was something far older, far more insidious. It didn't just want their bodies, it wanted their souls. It wanted them to forget who they were, to surrender to its dark whispers and become part of its eternal cycle. Rachel felt a deep pang of sorrow for her friend. She had tried to save him. She had tried to keep him grounded, to remind him of who he was. But the forest had already claimed him, and now it would use him to lure her in. And then, with a final sorrowful glance at Henry, Rachel turned and ran. The forest shifted around her, the trees bending and groaning as though they were alive, their branches reaching toward her with claws. The whispers became louder, more insistent, pulling at her mind, urging her to give in, to stop running, to accept her fate. But she couldn't stop. Not yet. She wasn't done. She wouldn't let them win. The ground beneath her feet trembled again, and the sound of the creature's terrible roar echoed in the distance, reverberating through the trees. But Rachel didn't stop. She couldn't. With one last burst of strength, she pushed through the underbrush, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath ragged. She could feel the presence of the forest surrounding her, could feel its hunger, its need to claim her. But she wouldn't let it. Not this time. Not ever again. And as she ran, she realized that the battle was far from over. The forest had taken so much from her already, but she wasn't going to let it take anything more. Not Henry. Not herself. Not her soul. Not today. Rachel's legs burned as she sprinted through the dense forest, her breath ragged. The whispers were closing in, the voices begging her to stop, to return. But she couldn't. Not after everything. Not after what had happened to Henry. She stumbled, falling to the ground, but quickly pushed herself up. There was a light ahead, a break in the trees. Freedom. The creature was behind her, its presence a looming shadow in the darkness. The voice of Henry echoed through the woods, desperate, pleading. "Rachel, come back, please." But it wasn't him. Not anymore. It was the forest. The creature. It was trying to pull her in, to make her turn back. But she couldn't. Not for him. Not for anything. With all her strength, Rachel pushed forward, her feet pounding against the earth. The clearing was within reach. The whispers grew louder, but she didn't stop. She burst into the clearing, the moonlight illuminating the space. But there, at the edge of the trees, the creature appeared, a swirling mass of darkness, its tendrils reaching for her. Rachel's heart raced as she felt its hunger, its presence suffocating. She gripped the pendant around her neck, feeling its power surge through her. She wasn't going to give in. Not now. The creature hesitated, as if sensing the strength she had. She stood tall, her voice steady as she faced it. "I will not be your prey." The creature screamed, a wail that shook the earth, and began to dissolve, retreating back into the woods, vanishing into the shadows. Silence returned to the clearing. The whispers were gone, and the weight of the forest lifted. But Rachel knew the truth. The battle had been won, but the forest would always be with her, lingering in the back of her mind. She looked around, breathing heavily, trying to steady her thoughts. But something caught her eye. A figure walking toward her from the trees. It was Henry. Her heart skipped a beat. But as the figure drew closer, she saw that it wasn't him. It was something else. Something dark. The forest wasn't done with her yet. Rachel turned, her breath quickening as the shadows of the woods closed in around her once more. If you enjoyed the story, be sure to give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales. Thank you for listening, and until next time, stay safe and keep your lights on.